History doesn't always give us answers. Sometimes it just leaves behind evidence. A skeleton with no cause of death. A city abandoned overnight. A message carved in stone that no linguist alive can read. These aren't ghost stories passed down around fires. These are real events, documented by archaeologists, historians, and scientists who walked away with more questions than they came with. 20 mysteries. 20 moments where human knowledge hit a wall and stopped cold. The past is darker and stranger than most textbooks dare to admit. So let's go there together. On the western coast of modern-day Turkey, buried beneath centuries of soil, earthquake rubble, and forgotten empire, lies what remains of Ephesus, once one of the largest and most powerful cities in the ancient world. At its peak, nearly 500,000 people walked its marble streets. Merchants, philosophers, emperors, and pilgrims all passed through its grand colonnaded avenues. Then, slowly, the city was swallowed. By time, by sediment, by silence. Archaeologists have been carefully excavating Ephesus since the mid-1800s. What they've uncovered is extraordinary. Temples, libraries, bathhouses, and elaborate underground tunnel systems that hint at a civilization far more architecturally sophisticated than many had imagined. But it's what they haven't fully uncovered that quietly unsettles the researchers who work here. Beneath the lower terraces of the ancient city, embedded into a subterranean passage that predates much of the Roman construction above it, there are doors. Bronze, sealed, and by all accounts deliberately locked from the outside. The doors themselves are not a secret. They appear in excavation notes, in passing references within archaeological journals, and in the accounts of several researchers who have worked the site. What is conspicuously absent is any detailed published investigation into what lies behind them. The passage in which they sit is believed to date somewhere between the 6th and 4th centuries BC, predating the Roman period that most tourists associate with Ephesus today. The construction style suggests a pre-Roman, possibly Hellenistic, or even earlier origin. The bronze used in the doors shows an unusual alloy composition, one that archaeologists have noted doesn't align cleanly with the metallurgical traditions typical of the region during that period. That detail, quiet and technical as it is, raises an uncomfortable question. If the doors don't match the construction norms of their supposed era, who built them? And using knowledge acquired from where? The mainstream archaeological position is measured and reasonable. Sealed underground chambers beneath ancient cities are not unusual. They served as storage vaults, sacred repositories, or structural foundations. The locking mechanism, scholars suggest, was likely ceremonial, a final sealing of something considered either sacred or dangerous to disturb. Mystery cults were deeply embedded in Ephesian culture. The city was home to the Temple of Artemis, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and spiritual secrecy was not just practiced here, it was institutionalized. That explanation satisfies many, but not all. A smaller, more speculative school of thought points to the unusual depth of the passage, the atypical metallurgy, and the near-complete absence of formal documentation as evidence of deliberate suppression rather than academic oversight. Some independent researchers have suggested the chamber connects to a broader network of subterranean structures beneath the Aegean coast. Structures that, if mapped in full, might challenge existing timelines of organized civilization in the region. Others have noted that several ancient texts, including fragmented Hellenistic manuscripts held in European collections, contain what appear to be oblique references to a sealed repository at Ephesus, one said to contain either sacred writings, physical artifacts, or both. The manuscripts are incomplete, the references are vague, and the academic consensus treats them largely as metaphorical. Perhaps they are. The excavation of Ephesus continues today. New sections of the city are uncovered every season, each layer revealing something older, something quieter, something less easily explained than what came before it. The bronze doors remain sealed. No formal excavation of the chamber beyond them has been publicly announced. No ground-penetrating radar results from that specific section of the site have been released for peer review, and so the question that lingers, the one that serious researchers lower their voices to ask, is not simply what is behind those doors. It's why, after all this time, no one has officially looked. Ephesus leaves us standing at a sealed door, staring at a lock no one has officially moved to open. But travel 500 kilometers east, deeper into the Anatolian interior, and the mystery doesn't get smaller. It gets older, and considerably stranger. In the Cappadocia region of central Turkey, the landscape itself seems to belong to another world. Volcanic rock formations called fairy chimneys rise from the earth in tall, tapered columns, carved by millions of years of erosion into shapes that look almost intentional. The ground here is soft, a compressed volcanic ash called tuff. And for thousands of years, civilizations took advantage of that softness. They carved into it, downward. What they built beneath the surface of Derinkuyu is, by any measure, one of the most astonishing feats of ancient engineering ever discovered. A subterranean city. Not a tunnel system, not a series of connected cellars, but a fully functional underground civilization spanning at least 18 stories beneath the earth, capable of housing an estimated 20,000 people along with their livestock, food stores, wineries, chapels, and ventilation shafts that somehow, after thousands of years, still work. Derinkuyu was rediscovered in 1963 when a local man renovating his home broke through a wall and found a tunnel behind it. That tunnel led to another, and another. What followed was one of the most quietly staggering archaeological revelations of the 20th century. The city had been there the entire time, beneath the feet of every person who had ever walked that ground. And nobody knew. The official historical record attributes Derinkuyu's construction to the Phrygians, sometime around the 8th to 7th centuries BC, with later expansions by early Christian communities who used it as refuge from Roman persecution. That narrative is well supported, documented, and widely accepted. The city's upper levels show clear signs of Byzantine and early Christian occupation. Crosses are carved into doorways. Chapel spaces have been identified. The logic of its use as a hiding place is sound and credible, but the deeper you go, literally and figuratively, the harder that narrative is to sustain cleanly. Because beneath the Christian levels, beneath the Phrygian construction markers, at the lowest excavated depths of Derinkuyu, researchers have found something that doesn't fit the established timeline. Chambers where the walls are not carved, not chiseled, not scraped, not worked in any conventional sense. They are smooth, vitrified. The stone has the appearance of having been melted and then cooled, fused into a glassy, hardened surface that bears no tool marks whatsoever. Vitrification of stone requires temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius, in an enclosed underground environment, with no obvious source of fire, no evidence of the fuel required to sustain that kind of heat, and no cultural or technological framework from the supposed construction period that would explain how it was achieved. Geologists who have examined the phenomenon have offered several measured explanations. Volcanic activity in the region is ancient and well documented. Cappadocia's very landscape was shaped by eruptions from the now dormant Erciyes and Hasan volcanoes. It is scientifically plausible, some argue, that certain chambers were naturally formed, or at least thermally influenced by geothermal activity deep within the earth, and that early inhabitants found these naturally vitrified spaces and incorporated them into their expanding subterranean network. That is a reasonable position. It is also, to some researchers, an incomplete one. The vitrified chambers are not random. They are not scattered throughout the complex in the way you might expect if they were the product of uneven, chaotic volcanic activity. They appear in specific locations, deep, isolated, structurally distinct from the surrounding carved tunnels. Some investigators have noted what appears to be intentional architectural integration of these spaces, as though whoever designed the lower levels of Derinkuyu built around them, or toward them, with deliberate purpose. The question that follows is one archaeologists are careful with, because it pulls the timeline in a direction that orthodox scholarship is reluctant to go. If these chambers were not naturally formed, if they were in some way deliberately created or shaped using a heat source we cannot currently identify, then whoever made them did so at a level of technological capability that has no place in our accepted understanding of ancient Anatolian civilization. Some researchers in the fringe archaeology space have gone further, suggesting that the lowest levels of Derinkuyu may significantly predate the Phrygian attribution, potentially by thousands of years. They point to the vitrified chambers as evidence of a prehistorical culture with access to technologies or techniques that were either lost, suppressed, or simply not yet recovered by conventional excavation. Others have drawn comparisons to similarly vitrified underground chambers found at sites in Peru, Scotland, and the broader Middle East, including locations in what is now Lebanon and parts of ancient Palestine, suggesting not isolated incidents, but a pattern. A global pattern of underground spaces where stone has been subjected to extreme, focused, and as yet unexplained heat. Whether those comparisons represent genuine connection or coincidental geology is a debate that remains very much open. What is not open to debate is this: Derinkuyu has only been partially excavated. Authorities estimate that as little as half of the total complex has been formally explored. Tunnels extend beyond the current accessible sections. Several passages remain blocked, either by deliberate ancient sealing or by structural collapse. And the deepest accessible chambers, the ones with the smooth fused walls, sit at the edge of what excavation has reached. Below them, presumably, there is more. How much more, and what condition it is in, and what it might tell us about who truly built the lowest levels of this city and why, that remains unknown. Derinkuyu has given us 20,000 years of human ingenuity pressed into volcanic rock. It has given us ventilation systems that defy simple explanation, rolling stone doors that can only be opened from the inside, and walls that appear to have been touched by a heat source no historian has yet named. What it hasn't given us, not yet, is a complete answer. And in the silence of those lowest chambers, in the dim light reflecting off walls that should not exist the way they do, that absence feels like something more than a gap in the record. It feels like a question someone long ago deliberately chose not to answer. Derinkuyu leaves us in the dark, quite literally, standing at the edge of chambers where stone has been shaped by forces we cannot fully name, in a city that may be far older than the history books are comfortable admitting. But underground mysteries are not confined to Turkey's volcanic interior. Sometimes the strangeness rises to the surface. Sometimes it breathes. Among the lesser-examined documents of Byzantine travel literature, manuscripts that survive in fragmented form across archives in Constantinople, Alexandria, and Rome, there exists a series of accounts written independently by travelers and clergy moving through the eastern Mediterranean between roughly the 4th and 7th centuries AD. These accounts vary in detail, in language, and in purpose, but several of them share something unusual: a reference, recurring, consistent, and never fully explained. They write of a tomb that breathes, not metaphorically, not as spiritual allegory, though Byzantine writers were certainly capable of both. These accounts describe a physical phenomenon, a sealed stone structure described variously as a mausoleum, a burial vault, or a sacred enclosure from which a rhythmic movement of air could be detected. A slow, regular exhale and inhale of cool air from the sealed edges of the stone. Consistent enough that travelers noted it on separate visits. Disturbing enough that some refused to approach it. The location described in the majority of these accounts places the structure somewhere along the ancient trade and pilgrimage routes of the eastern Levant. In the hill country of what is now the Palestinian interior, a landscape already dense with ancient burial tradition, cave tombs, and sacred geography stretching back thousands of years before the Byzantine period. The terrain is limestone karst, a geology riddled with natural cavities, underground water systems, and passages that connect in ways even modern surveys haven't fully mapped. That geological fact is where mainstream scholarship begins, and reasonably so. Limestone karst environments are known to produce what geologists call cave breathing, the natural movement of air through underground passages as atmospheric pressure changes. When surface pressure drops, air moves outward from underground cavities. When it rises, air is drawn back in. To someone standing at the sealed edge of a tomb built over or adjacent to such a cavity, the effect would be precisely what the Byzantine travelers described. A slow, rhythmic exchange of air from a structure that should, by all appearances, be completely sealed. It is a rational explanation. It accounts for the physical phenomenon without requiring anything beyond natural geology. And for many historians, that is where the inquiry ends. But several details in the original accounts resist that clean resolution. The first is consistency. Multiple travelers, writing across a span of nearly 3 centuries, describe the same structure in enough detail, its approximate location, its construction material, the carved markings on its exterior, to suggest they are documenting the same place. This is not a rumor spreading from a single source. These are independent observations, recorded at different times by people who had no documented contact with one another. The second is the markings. Several accounts make specific reference to symbols carved into the exterior stone of the tomb, symbols that the writers themselves could not identify, and that they noted with visible unease were unlike the funerary markings common to Jewish, early Christian, or Roman burial traditions of the region. One account, written by a Cappadocian monk traveling through Palestine in the late 5th century AD, describes the carvings as appearing to predate the structure itself, as though the stones had been sourced from somewhere older and repurposed. Repurposed from what? He did not know. He noted only that the symbols made the local guides reluctant to translate, and that when pressed, they said only that the tomb had always been there, that no one remembered it being built. The third detail is the one that fringe researchers find most compelling, and that mainstream scholarship treats most cautiously. Several of the Byzantine accounts describe the air emerging from the tomb as cold, noticeably unnaturally cold, even in the height of summer. Cold air from underground spaces is not itself unusual, but the degree of cold described and the consistency of it across multiple independent accounts separated by decades has led some investigators to question whether the phenomenon was purely geological or whether the structure was built, deliberately, by someone with specific technical knowledge, to function as a ventilation terminus for something much larger beneath it. The idea is speculative, but it mirrors, almost precisely, what archaeologists have confirmed about Derinkuyu, where ventilation shafts were engineered with such sophistication that they maintained consistent airflow across 18 underground levels. If subterranean engineering of that complexity existed in Cappadocia, the question of whether similar knowledge existed elsewhere in the ancient world is not an unreasonable one to sit with. No excavation of the suspected site has been formally conducted. The region's complex political and archaeological jurisdiction, combined with the density of already documented sites competing for research attention and funding, has meant that a structure known only through fragmentary Byzantine literature has never risen to the top of any official excavation agenda. The manuscripts themselves remain in partial translation. Several key folios of the most detailed account, the Cappadocian monk's travel record, are listed as damaged beyond legible recovery in the archive that holds them. Whether that damage is the result of age or something more deliberate is impossible to say. What remains is the description itself. Cool air, moving steadily, from stone that has been sealed for longer than anyone can remember. Markings that predate the structure they are carved into. A location that has never been excavated, and accounts that have never been fully reconciled with the geological record. Somewhere in the limestone hills of the ancient Levant, if the Byzantine travelers were telling the truth, there is a tomb that has been exhaling quietly for centuries. And whatever it is breathing over, whatever lies beneath that slow, cold current of air, has not yet been found. A tomb that breathes. Cool air rising from sealed stone, from markings no one could read, above something no one has yet excavated. It is the kind of mystery that stays with you, not because it is loud, but because it is patient, because it has been waiting, quietly, for someone to ask the right question. And patience, it turns out, is a theme that runs through the ancient world far more consistently than we tend to acknowledge. Civilizations buried things, not always out of fear, not always out of reverence. Sometimes it seems they buried things because they understood that the surface world is temporary, and that what matters most should be placed somewhere the surface world cannot easily reach. Which brings us to water, specifically to the dark, moving water that flows beneath what was once one of the most important cities in the ancient Mediterranean. A city that shaped empires, hosted apostles, and sat at the crossroads of 3 continents. A city whose surface has been studied extensively, and whose depths remain in critical ways, largely uncharted. Ancient Antioch. Modern Antakya in southern Turkey, just miles from the Syrian border. At its height during the Roman and early Byzantine periods, Antioch was the 3rd largest city in the known world, surpassed only by Rome and Alexandria. It was a place of extraordinary cultural density. Greek, Roman, Jewish, early Christian, Persian, and Syrian influences layering over one another across centuries of continuous habitation. The Apostle Paul launched his missionary journeys from here. The followers of Jesus were first called Christians within these city walls. Emperors visited, built, and were buried here. And beneath all of it, the Orontes River, ancient, steady, and in places subterranean, runs through the geological foundation of the city, like a slow, dark current beneath everything that was ever built above it. Archaeological work in Antioch has been ongoing, intermittently, since the 1930s. The Princeton-led excavations of that era uncovered spectacular Roman-era mosaics, civic structures, and residential remains that are now considered among the finest examples of ancient urban archaeology in the world. But the excavations were always limited in scope, focused primarily on the upper layers, the visible Roman city, the mosaic floors and colonnaded streets that drew academic attention and funding. What lies beneath those layers has been touched only at the edges. In the course of several excavations, both the early Princeton digs and more recent Turkish archaeological surveys, researchers have encountered, at various points beneath the city, evidence of an earlier structural presence near the underground water systems. Carved stone passages, deliberately shaped channels that do not align with Roman-era engineering conventions. And in at least one documented instance, a chamber, partially collapsed, partially flooded, that contained architectural features inconsistent with any known civic or residential function. The chamber's walls bore niches, regularly spaced, carefully carved, of a depth and dimension consistent with housing cult objects or votive offerings. The floor, where visible above the waterline, showed signs of deliberate surfacing, smoothed stone, not natural bedrock. And the chamber's orientation, researchers noted, appeared to be aligned not with the Roman street grid above it, but with the flow of the underground water channel that ran adjacent to it. In other words, whatever this space was, it was built in relationship to the water, oriented toward it, possibly dependent on it. The mainstream interpretation is cautious and considered. Water cult sites were common throughout the ancient world. Springs, rivers, and underground water sources were frequently sacralized, treated as divine thresholds, as boundaries between the living world and whatever lay beneath it. Antioch's pre-Roman history includes Seleucid Greek occupation stretching back to the 4th century BC, and before that, indigenous Syrian and possibly Hittite cultural presence reaching much further into antiquity. Any of those layers could have produced a sacred water site of this kind. That is entirely plausible. And yet several features of the Antioch chamber resist easy categorization within known cult site typologies. The first is its depth. The chamber sits significantly below the Seleucid occupation layer, meaning it likely predates the Greek city entirely. If accurate, that places its construction in a period for which Antioch's archaeological record is almost completely silent, a period we know very little about. The second is the water itself. The underground channel adjacent to the chamber is not a natural spring or seepage point. It shows signs of having been deliberately directed. the rock around it shaped and smoothed in ways that suggest intentional channeling of the river's flow toward the chamber's location. Someone, at some point, engineered the water to go there. The third detail is the one that sits most uneasily in the formal record. Among the carved niches in the chamber walls, researchers documented a series of markings. Not figurative, not clearly linguistic, but deeply and regularly incised into the stone in a pattern that several analysts described as neither Greek, Aramaic, nor any known Semitic script of the region. Photographs of these markings have been referenced in excavation reports, but have not, to date, been the subject of any published epigraphic analysis. Why not is a question without a clean answer. Antioch sits in a seismically active zone. The catastrophic earthquake of 526 AD killed a documented 250,000 people and reshaped the city's physical geography permanently. Later earthquakes, including devastating ones in the modern era, have further complicated excavation. The instability of the ground beneath Antakya is real, documented, and genuinely limiting to archaeological work. But instability alone does not explain why a partially explored subterranean chamber with anomalous markings and a pre-Seleucid construction date has not attracted more formal investigative attention in the decades since its initial documentation. Beneath the streets of one of history's most significant cities, water still moves through ancient passages in the dark. It flows past walls that were carved before the Greeks arrived, past niches that once held something, past markings that no published scholar has formally attempted to read. Whatever was worshipped in that chamber, whatever relationship its builders sought with the dark water moving beside them, it has kept its secret with remarkable persistence. And the river, as it always has, simply keeps flowing. Beneath Antioch, water carries its secrets through engineered darkness, past markings no one has formally read, toward a destination that remains unknown. It is a reminder that the ancient world was not simply built on the surface. It was constructed in layers, each one pressing down on something older, something quieter, something that was never meant to be easily found. That layering is not unique to Turkey or the Levant. It appears with striking consistency wherever the ancient world chose to honor its dead. Because the dead, it seems, were never simply buried. They were placed, deliberately, carefully, and in relationship to something the living believed existed beneath the ground. A presence, an energy, a threshold between what we are and what we become. The architecture of ancient burial sites reflects that belief not as metaphor, but as engineering. The dead were given spaces designed with intention, and in some of those spaces, something was built that we still cannot fully explain. Which brings us to North Africa, to the edge of the Libyan plateau, where the Mediterranean coast gives way to limestone escarpments dropping toward the sea, to a city that was, for several centuries, one of the wealthiest and most intellectually significant in the Greek-speaking world, and to a necropolis so vast, so elaborately constructed, and so acoustically strange that the researchers who have spent the most time inside it tend to describe the experience in ways that go beyond archaeology. They describe it as something that listens back. Cyrene, in modern northeastern Libya, was founded by Greek colonists from the island of Thera around 631 BC. It grew rapidly into one of the great cities of the ancient Mediterranean, a center of philosophy, medicine, and trade that produced thinkers of lasting influence and attracted the attention of every major power that moved through North Africa. The Ptolemies claimed it. Rome eventually absorbed it, and through every transition of political ownership, the city's necropolis continued to expand, carved directly into the limestone plateau surrounding the urban center, eventually extending for kilometers in every direction. The serene necropolis is, by any measure, extraordinary. Thousands of tomb facades are cut into the cliff faces. Elaborate multi-chambered burial complexes descend through multiple levels into the rock. Decorative programs range from simple carved doorways to sophisticated architectural facades that mirror the temples and civic buildings of the city above. UNESCO designated Cyrene a World Heritage Site in 1982, and the necropolis is considered one of the best preserved ancient burial landscapes in the entire Mediterranean world. but preservation in this case has not meant full understanding. Deep within the lower sections of the necropolis, below the tomb facades that tourists and early archaeologists concentrated on, in chambers that require deliberate effort to access and document, researchers have identified a network of caverns that do not conform to the standard burial typology of the site. These spaces are not tombs in any recognizable sense. They contain no burial niches, no sarcophagi, no funerary inscriptions. What they contain, carved into their walls with careful regularity, are channels. Shallow, precisely cut grooves running from the upper sections of the walls down toward the floors, converging at central points in each chamber with an intentionality that speaks of design rather than accident. And they whisper. Not always, not to everyone, but consistently enough, and documented by enough separate researchers across enough separate visits, that the acoustic phenomenon of these chambers has made its way into the formal archaeological literature. Carefully worded, scientifically framed, but present. Under certain atmospheric conditions, particularly in the early morning hours when temperature differentials between the chambers and the exterior are most pronounced, the movement of air through the carved channels produces sound. A low, directional, sustained sound that early excavators described variously as murmuring, breathing, or, in the account that has attracted the most subsequent attention, whispering. The geological explanation is structurally similar to what we encountered in the limestone hills of the Levant. Karst topography produces natural airflow through underground cavities. The carved channels, mainstream archaeologists suggest, may have been designed to manage moisture and ventilation within the burial complex, a practical solution to the problem of preserving the chambers and their contents over long periods. The acoustic byproduct under this interpretation is incidental, an emergent property of good ancient engineering, not an intended feature. That explanation has merit. It is grounded in real geology and reasonable inference about ancient construction practice. But the channels are too precise for purely utilitarian interpretation to fully satisfy. Their depth is consistent to within millimeters across chambers separated by significant distances. Their convergence points are geometrically deliberate, and crucially, they are present only in the caverns that contain no burials, the spaces that appear to have served a different function entirely from the tombs surrounding them. Some researchers working in archaeoacoustics, a relatively young discipline that examines the deliberate use of sound in ancient sacred spaces, have proposed that the Cyrene caverns represent an intentional acoustic installation. That whoever carved those channels understood, with practical precision, how air moving through shaped stone produces sound. And that the sound itself was the point, a designed element of a ritual space where the boundary between the living and the dead was meant to be experienced as something sensory, something audible, something that made the presence of whatever lay beyond feel immediate and real. That interpretation remains contested. The archaeoacoustic field itself is still establishing its methodological credibility within mainstream archaeology, and claims about intentional ancient sound design require careful evidential support that the Cyrene site has not yet fully provided. What the site has provided is the sound itself, documented, repeatable under specific conditions, and produced by carved features that have no fully satisfying functional explanation. In the lower caverns of Cyrene's necropolis, in the dark below the dark, air moves through channels that someone cut with extraordinary care into the living rock. It finds its way through geometries that have survived 2,500 years intact. And under the right conditions, in the early hours before the heat of the Libyan day silences everything, those geometries speak. Whether that was always the intention, whether the dead of Cyrene were meant to have a voice, is a question that the caverns raise with quiet, persistent insistence, and have not, in 26 centuries, seen fit to answer. The caverns of Cyrene whisper in the dark, through channels carved with a precision that still resists full explanation, toward an audience that may have been the whole point. Sound as threshold, stone as instrument. The dead, perhaps, given a voice by the living who understood something about the relationship between geometry, air, and the space where the human world ends. It is a haunting idea, and it connects, more directly than it might first appear, to what comes next. Because across the ancient world, in cultures that had no documented contact with one another, the same belief surfaces with remarkable consistency: that certain places are not simply locations, that some points on the earth are nodes, intersections between the physical world and something beyond it, places where the boundary thins, where what is normally invisible becomes, under the right conditions, briefly and undeniably present. Most of those places share a common characteristic. They are difficult to reach. They demand something from the person who approaches them, and they tend, with unsettling regularity, to produce experiences that the people who have them spend the rest of their lives trying to describe. There is perhaps no place on Earth that fits that description more completely than a single mountain rising from the remote Tibetan plateau in the far west of what is now the Tibet Autonomous Region of China. A peak that has never been summited, that 4 of the world's major religions consider the most sacred geographic location in existence, that draws tens of thousands of pilgrims every year to complete a circumambulation of its base, a journey of roughly 52 kilometers at an altitude that makes every step a deliberate act of endurance. Mount Kailash. 6,638 meters of black rock and glacial ice, rising in near-perfect symmetry from a landscape so remote and so elevationally extreme that simply being there requires the body to operate at its absolute limits. It stands alone, geographically isolated from the surrounding Himalayan and Trans-Himalayan ranges in a way that geologists find notable. No other peak of comparable height rises in such geographic isolation in the region. It does not belong to a range so much as it presides over one. Hindu tradition identifies Kailash as the earthly throne of Shiva. Tibetan Buddhist cosmology places it at the center of the universe, the axis around which all existence revolves, the point from which the 4 great rivers of Asia flow outward to the 4 cardinal directions. The Jain tradition venerates it as the site of spiritual liberation for its first enlightened teacher. The ancient Bon religion of Tibet, predating Buddhism in the region by an unknown but significant span of time, regards Kailash as the soul of an entire spiritual geography stretching across the plateau. 4 religions, millennia of independent theological development, one mountain. That convergence alone is remarkable. But it is not what brings us here. What brings us here is what the pilgrims saw above it, beginning in the earliest surviving written accounts of Kailash pilgrimage, texts from the Bon tradition that predate the arrival of Buddhism in Tibet, and continuing through Hindu pilgrimage literature, Tibetan Buddhist monastic records, and eventually the journals of the first Western explorers to reach the region in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. There is a recurring description of a phenomenon observed above the mountain's upper elevations, particularly at night and in the transitional hours of dawn and dusk. Lights. Not the reflected light of snow and ice, which early observers were perfectly capable of distinguishing. Not lightning, which the accounts specifically differentiate from what they are describing, but slow, sustained moving illuminations, described variously as spheres, columns, or diffuse radiances, that appear above the peak, move in patterns that do not correspond to any meteorological phenomenon the observers recognized, and then diminish or disappear without traceable cause. The accounts span at least 15 centuries of documented observation. They come from people of radically different cultural backgrounds, different religious frameworks, different languages, and different epistemological starting points. A Bon monk in the 8th century AD and a British surveyor in 1905 are not drawing on a shared tradition when they describe the same phenomenon in remarkably similar terms. Atmospheric science offers a range of relevant explanations, and they deserve serious consideration. Kailash's extreme altitude and geographic isolation create unusual meteorological conditions. The mountain sits at the convergence of several distinct air mass boundaries, producing localized atmospheric phenomena that lower altitude observers would rarely encounter. Ball lightning, while still incompletely understood, is a documented, if rare, phenomenon that produces exactly the kind of slow-moving luminous spheres described in many of the accounts. Piezoelectric effects, the generation of electrical charge by pressure on crystalline rock, have been studied as a possible source of light phenomena above seismically active mountain regions, and the Tibetan Plateau is among the most tectonically active landscapes on Earth. Each of these explanations is scientifically grounded. None of them, individually or in combination, has been demonstrated to fully account for the consistency, duration, and behavioral characteristics described across the breadth of the historical record. The fringe research space has, predictably, moved further. Theories invoking everything from concentrated geomagnetic anomalies to structured plasma phenomena to interpretations that resist any conventional physical framework have been proposed, debated, and left unresolved. What they share is a recognition that the standard atmospheric explanations leave something unexplained, a residue of observation that the available scientific vocabulary does not yet cleanly accommodate. What no one disputes is the mountain itself. Its symmetry, which is striking enough that early visitors questioned whether it was natural. Its isolation, which remains geographically anomalous. Its status, across 4 independent religious traditions, as the single most sacred point on the planet's surface. And above it, in the thin air of the Tibetan night, something that pilgrims have been seeing for at least 1,500 years of recorded history. Something that moves with a quality they consistently describe not as threatening, not as random, but as deliberate. As though whatever produces the light above Kailash is, in some way, aware that it is being watched, and has been, for a very long time, entirely unbothered by that fact. Above Mount Kailash, something moves through the thin Tibetan air with what witnesses across 15 centuries have described as quiet, unhurried deliberateness. It does not announce itself. It does not explain itself. It simply appears, persists, and withdraws, leaving behind the particular kind of unease that comes not from danger, but from the steady, unresolvable sense that something is present that our current frameworks cannot accommodate. That feeling of standing at the edge of an explanation that refuses to complete itself is one we have returned to again and again across this exploration. And it does not diminish with familiarity. If anything, it deepens, because the mysteries that endure are not the ones that are simply unexplained. They are the ones that suggest, quietly but persistently, that the explanation exists, that someone, at some point, knew exactly what was happening, and that the knowledge was deliberately, carefully, and permanently sealed away. We return now to Cappadocia. We have been here before. Beneath the volcanic tuff of central Turkey, inside the subterranean city of Derinkuyu, we encountered vitrified walls and engineering that challenged comfortable timelines. But Cappadocia is vast, and Derinkuyu is not its only secret. The region's geology, that same soft, carvable volcanic rock that made underground cities possible, is riddled with natural and man-made cavities that archaeologists are still, decades into systematic survey, working to fully catalog. In the course of that ongoing work, in a section of the Cappadocian Plateau located several kilometers from the major known underground sites, a cave system was documented that has received almost no public attention, and a level of academic attention that many researchers consider disproportionately sparse given what it contains. The cave itself is not large. Its entrance, partially obscured by a rockfall that appears to have occurred sometime in the early medieval period, opens into a descending passage approximately 2 meters wide that curves and narrows before opening into a central chamber of modest dimensions. The chamber is dry, the volcanic rock walls intact, the ceiling uncompromised. It is, structurally, a well-preserved space, and it is filled, almost entirely, with human bones, not scattered. Not the chaotic, disordered accumulation you might expect from a mass burial or an emergency internment. The bones in this chamber are arranged. Sorted, in fact. Long bones stacked with long bones, skulls placed in deliberate groupings along the chamber's interior walls, smaller skeletal elements gathered and positioned with a consistency that speaks unmistakably of human organization. Someone spent considerable time in this chamber, handling these remains with care and intention, arranging them according to a logic that the arrangement itself does not reveal. The number of individuals represented is estimated based on preliminary analysis at somewhere between 200 and 300. The estimate carries uncertainty because the analysis has been limited. No full forensic anthropological study of the deposit has been formally published. What is known from initial documentation is that the remains represent individuals of varying age and sex, that there is no obvious evidence of traumatic death in the bones examined, and that the deposit appears to have been sealed. The entrance deliberately blocked from the outside, at some point after the final arrangement was completed. The mainstream interpretations cluster around two broad possibilities, both archaeologically reasonable. The first is ossuary practice, the secondary burial tradition common across the ancient Near East and Mediterranean, in which bones were collected from primary burial sites after decomposition and reinterred communally in a dedicated space. This practice was widespread, theologically motivated, and architecturally varied, from the elaborate ossuaries of early Jewish burial tradition in Palestine to the bone chapels of medieval Christian Europe. A sealed communal bone deposit in a Cappadocian cave is, under this interpretation, unusual in its scale, but not in its fundamental nature. The second possibility is plague or disaster burial, a rapid, pragmatic response to mass death that required the organization and containment of large numbers of remains in a short period. Cappadocia experienced significant population disruption across multiple historical periods, from Persian and Arab incursions through Byzantine-era conflicts and epidemic disease events. Both interpretations are plausible. Neither has been formally advanced with the evidential support that the site appears to warrant, because the site has not been formally excavated. What has drawn the attention of the smaller number of researchers who have examined the documentary record more closely are several details that sit awkwardly within both mainstream frameworks. The first is the sorting. Ossuary practice involves the collection and reinterment of bones, but the degree of categorical organization in this chamber, the precision of the sorting, the consistency of the placement across what must have been a significant logistical undertaking in a confined underground space, exceeds what is typically documented in regional ossuary sites. It suggests not simply the practical management of remains, but a deliberate, possibly ritualized ordering that carried meaning to whoever performed it. The second is what is absent. In virtually every known ossuary context across the ancient world, the bone deposit is accompanied by some form of material culture: pottery, personal ornaments, inscriptions, lamps, or votive objects that connect the space to a specific cultural and temporal context. The Cappadocian chamber contains none of these: the bones, the rock, and the arrangement. Nothing else. The third detail is the ceiling itself. The rockfall that partially obscured the entrance shows evidence, on internal examination, of having been assisted. Stones positioned from within the passage before the final closure, in a pattern consistent with deliberate blocking rather than purely natural collapse. Someone sealed this chamber from the inside. Whether that person then exited through another passage that has not yet been identified, or whether the sealing was a final act with no planned exit, is a question the chamber does not answer. 300 silent, sorted, carefully placed individuals in a sealed room beneath the Cappadocian Plateau. No objects, no inscriptions, no cultural markers, no formal excavation, no published explanation. Just the arrangement itself, patient, precise, and absolute, waiting in the dark for someone to understand what it means. And the question that follows every researcher who has documented this site out of the cave and back into the daylight above: who sealed the door? And why did they make sure it could not be opened from the outside? A sealed chamber beneath the Cappadocian Plateau. 300 sorted, silent individuals arranged with a care that suggests purpose, enclosed by someone who made certain the door could not be opened from the outside. No explanation, no inscription, no exit that we have found. There is a particular quality to mysteries that involve the deliberate concealment of human remains. They press on something instinctive, some deep, pre-rational awareness that the dead deserve accounting, that the story of how a person ended should be knowable, should be recoverable. When it isn't, when the evidence has been arranged and then sealed away with apparent intention, the unease that follows is not merely intellectual. It is something older than that, and it is an unease that crosses continents. Because the question of people who vanish, not bodies, not bones, but living communities who are present one season and simply gone the next, appears in the historical record with a frequency that careful historians acknowledge and rarely fully explain. Sometimes the disappearance leaves remains, as in Cappadocia. Sometimes it leaves only absence, a space where people were, structures still standing, routines interrupted mid-motion, and then nothing. We travel now from the volcanic interior of central Turkey to the extreme northwestern edge of the known medieval world. To a place so remote, so exposed to the full weight of the North Atlantic, that simply surviving a winter there in the early medieval period was an act of sustained, collective will. To a small island off the western coast of Scotland, separated from the Isle of Mull by a strait less than a mile wide, that became, against all geographic logic, one of the most important centers of Christian scholarship and spiritual life in the early medieval world. Iona. Barely 5 kilometers long and 2 kilometers wide. Bedrock and macaire grass and the particular gray-green light of the inner Hebrides, where the sky and the sea conduct a continuous, unresolved argument about where one ends and the other begins. St. Columba brought Christianity here from Ireland in 563 AD, establishing a monastic community on this exposed, wind-scoured rock that would go on to produce the Book of Kells, to Christianize much of Scotland and northern England, and to serve as the burial ground for generations of Scottish, Irish, and Norse kings. The monastery of Iona was, by any measure, a remarkable institution. It survived Viking raids. It survived the death of its founder. It survived political upheaval, theological controversy, and the relentless physical punishment of its environment. Its scriptorium produced manuscripts of extraordinary beauty under conditions of extraordinary hardship. The community was disciplined, resilient, and deeply documented. Iona's abbots kept records with a consistency unusual for the period, and those records survived in sufficient quantity to give historians a relatively detailed picture of the monastery's life across several centuries, which is precisely what makes the gap so visible. In the annalistic record, the Irish annals that documented Iona's affairs with reasonable regularity throughout the early medieval period, there exists a silence, a winter falling within a specific decade of the late 8th century, for which the expected documentation simply does not appear. No feast day records, no deaths recorded in the necrology, no correspondence received or dispatched, no administrative notation of any kind. Where the record had been continuous, it becomes, for the duration of a single winter season, entirely blank. When the record resumes the following spring, it does so as though recommencing after a disruption, the first entries noting the state of the community in terms that suggest resumption rather than continuation. The number of monks referenced in the immediately subsequent records is, by the most careful estimates of historians who have analyzed the annalistic language, significantly smaller than the population implied by records immediately preceding the silence. The mainstream historical explanation reaches, reasonably, for the Vikings. Norse raids on Iona are documented facts. The monastery was attacked in 795 AD, again in 802 AD, and again, devastatingly, in 806 AD, when 68 members of the community were killed at a beach still known as Martyrs Bay. Viking violence in the region during this period was real, sustained, and catastrophic. An undocumented raid during a winter when the community was particularly vulnerable, killing or dispersing the monks before a full record could be made, is an entirely plausible explanation for the annalistic silence. It is also, in the view of several historians who have examined the specific textual evidence most closely, not quite sufficient. The raids that are documented in the annals are documented precisely because someone survived them and wrote about them. The 806 massacre is known because the monks who fled to Ireland carried the knowledge with them and committed it to record. A winter of complete silence. No survivors, no refugees, no subsequent account from anyone who was present, represents a different order of disappearance. Not a raid that was survived and recorded, but an event from which no one emerged to describe what happened. Some researchers have pointed to epidemic disease. The early medieval period saw catastrophic plague events moving through monastic communities across Europe and the British Isles, and an isolated island community would have been particularly vulnerable to a virulent outbreak that killed faster than it could be documented or escaped. This explanation accounts for the totality of the silence in a way that a raid, which typically produces at least some survivors and witnesses, does not. Others have noted that the resumption of records the following spring carries a quality in its language and its apparent uncertainty about immediate preceding events that suggests the monks who resumed writing did not fully know what had happened to their predecessors, as though they arrived or emerged to find the community reduced by something they had not witnessed directly. What arrived on Iona that winter, moving through the gray dark between one year and the next, has never been formally identified. The island kept no record of it. The sea that surrounds it on all sides offered no witness, and the monks who vanished, scholars, scribes, keepers of some of the most sophisticated intellectual culture in the early medieval world, left behind their buildings, their unfinished manuscripts, and a silence in the record that no subsequent annotation has ever adequately filled. Iona still stands. The abbey was rebuilt. Pilgrims still cross the narrow strait and walk the same ground those monks walked. But the winter that emptied it remains, in the historical record, an unmarked absence. A page that was never written, by people who, until that season, had never failed to write. Iona leaves us with a page that was never written. A winter that consumed an entire community of scholars and scribes without producing a single survivor willing or able to describe what happened. The silence in the record is total, and it has endured for more than 12 centuries without resolution. There is something particularly unsettling about the disappearance of people who were, by profession and by vocation, record keepers. Monks who documented feast days and deaths, and the movement of abbots across the ecclesiastical landscape of early medieval Europe. People for whom the written word was not merely practical, but sacred. An act of preservation, of witness, of resistance against the erasure that time imposes on all things. When those people vanish without leaving a word, the absence carries a weight that ordinary silence does not. But Iona, for all its strangeness, left us at least with a question we can frame. We know who was there. We know approximately when they disappeared. We know the shape of the absence, even if we cannot fill it. What we encounter next is different. It is not the absence of record that disturbs, but the presence of evidence, physical, undeniable, and deeply resistant to the explanations that have been offered for it. Evidence that was not written down or archived or carried across the sea by fleeing survivors, but dug out of the ground, well by well, across a landscape that spent several centuries at the intersection of colliding civilizations, and has never fully released the secrets that intersection produced. We move now to the Iberian Peninsula, to the wide, sun-bleached plateau of central and southern Spain, a landscape that has been continuously inhabited for tens of thousands of years, that has been claimed and reclaimed by Carthaginians, Romans, Visigoths, Moors, and the medieval Christian kingdoms that pushed southward across it in the centuries-long campaign known as the Reconquista. A landscape so layered with history that archaeologists working any given site routinely pass through 4 or 5 distinct civilizational strata before reaching bedrock. It was in this landscape during the period of Visigothic dominance that stretched roughly from the early 5th century AD to the Muslim conquest of 701 AD that something happened in the wells. Not in one well, not in a single location that might be explained by a localized event, a single act of violence, or a contained disaster, but across dozens of sites, spread across the geographic breadth of what the Visigoths called Hispania, from the central Meseta to the coastal regions of the south and east, Archaeological excavation has repeatedly uncovered the same thing. Wells that were decommissioned, sealed, or simply abandoned during the Visigothic period, and that contain, at varying depths within their shafts, significant quantities of human skeletal remains. The phenomenon is well documented in the archaeological literature. It is not contested as a factual matter. The bones are there, have been recovered, have been analyzed, and have been reported in excavation journals and regional archaeological surveys spanning several decades of fieldwork. What is contested, with a vigor that itself suggests the discomfort the evidence produces, is what the bones mean. The mainstream interpretations are several, and each carries genuine evidential weight. The first and most frequently advanced is crisis disposal, the use of existing infrastructure, including decommissioned wells, as emergency burial sites during periods of epidemic disease, military conflict, or rapid population displacement. The Visigothic period in Hispania was not a peaceful one. It was characterized by internal dynastic instability, persistent conflict with neighboring powers, the gradual pressure of Byzantine encroachment from the southeast, and epidemic disease events that moved through the Mediterranean world with devastating regularity in the 6th and 7th centuries AD. Mass death under these conditions required rapid and pragmatic responses. A dry or decommissioned well was a practical solution. The second interpretation focuses on the Muslim conquest of 711 AD and its immediate aftermath, a period of significant violence and population disruption that could plausibly account for mass burials in unconventional locations across a wide geographic area in a relatively compressed time frame. Both explanations are historically grounded and archaeologically defensible, and yet they leave several specific features of the bone-filled wells inadequately accounted for. The first is the demographic profile of the remains. Forensic analysis of the skeletal material from multiple sites has revealed a pattern that does not align cleanly with either epidemic or conflict burial. The remains are not demographically representative of general population mortality. They skew consistently and significantly toward specific age and sex profiles that vary from site to site. One well containing predominantly adult males, another almost exclusively children and adolescents, another a mix of adult females and older individuals with a conspicuous absence of adult males of fighting age. This kind of demographic sorting does not occur naturally in crisis disposal contexts, where the dead are typically whoever happened to die in a given location and period. Someone, it appears, was selecting. The second feature is the physical condition of the bones themselves. At several sites, the skeletal remains show evidence not of traumatic death, not the blade marks and impact fractures typical of conflict burial, but of a pattern of perimortem bone modification that forensic anthropologists have described carefully and without sensationalism as consistent with the processing of remains after death. Defleshing marks, disarticulation at specific joints, a treatment of the bodies that suggests the wells were not the site of death, but the final destination of remains that had been handled elsewhere, for purposes that the handling itself does not make transparent. The third detail is perhaps the most difficult to place within any conventional framework. At a small number of the well sites, fewer than a dozen in the published record, but distributed across a wide enough geographic range to preclude localized explanation, the bone deposits are accompanied by objects, not funerary objects in any recognizable sense, not personal ornaments or grave goods or the material markers of mourning that accompany intentional burial in virtually every known cultural context across the ancient world. Instead, researchers have found small carved items, stone and bone objects of unclear function, bearing incised markings that do not correspond to any identified Visigothic, Roman, or early Christian symbol system, placed deliberately within the bone deposits, not scattered randomly through the fill. Placed, positioned in relationship to the skeletal material in a way that implies intention. What that intention was, what belief system or necessity or fear prompted the sorting of the dead by demographic category, the processing of their remains, and the placement of unidentified marked objects among their bones in sealed wells scattered across an entire peninsula, has not been formally proposed by any published academic analysis. The silence around that question is, in its own way, as complete as the silence in the annals of Iona. Across the sun-baked plateau of central Spain, beneath the foundations of villages that have been continuously inhabited since the Visigothic period, those wells still exist. Most have never been fully excavated. The bones that have been recovered sit in storage at regional archaeological facilities, cataloged and described and, in the most critical respects, still unexplained. And the objects? The small carved pieces with their unidentified markings, placed among the dead with such evident deliberateness, remain, as far as the published record indicates, unread. Whatever language they speak, no one has yet admitted to understanding it. The wells of Visigothic Hispania leave us with objects that no one has admitted to reading. Small carved things, placed among sorted bones with deliberate care, speaking a language that the published record has chosen, so far, not to pursue. It is a pattern we have encountered before in this exploration. Not the absence of evidence, but the presence of it, sitting in storage facilities and excavation notes and partially translated manuscripts, waiting for the question that has not yet been formally asked. That waiting quality, the sense of evidence suspended in a kind of institutional patience, connects, more than geographically, to what we encounter next. Because the story that follows also involves bones that were handled with intention, remains that were arranged according to a logic we have not recovered, and a crypt that sat, forgotten and sealed, beneath a landscape that had been continuously inhabited for over 1,000 years without anyone, apparently, thinking to look beneath it. We move north now, from the sun-bleached plateau of central Spain to the gray, wind-worn countryside of northeastern England, to a region that was, in the early medieval period, one of the most culturally and spiritually significant territories in the British Isles, and one of the most violently contested, Northumbria, the ancient kingdom that stretched from the Humber estuary in the south to the Firth of Forth in the north, encompassing what is now Yorkshire, County Durham, and the rugged borderlands approaching Scotland. Northumbria in the 7th and 8th centuries AD was a place of extraordinary contradictions. It produced the Venerable Bede, whose ecclesiastical history of the English people remains one of the foundational texts of medieval scholarship. Its monasteries at Lindisfarne, Jarrow, and Wearmouth were among the most intellectually productive institutions in the early medieval world. The Lindisfarne Gospels, produced on a tidal island off the Northumbrian coast, represent a pinnacle of insular manuscript art that has never been surpassed. It was also a landscape of persistent, brutal violence. Viking raids began hitting the Northumbrian coast in 793 AD with the attack on Lindisfarne, an event so shocking to the Christian world that Alcuin of York, writing from the court of Charlemagne, described it as a sign of divine punishment. What followed was not a series of isolated raids, but a sustained campaign of Norse expansion that within a century had transformed Northumbria's political and cultural landscape almost beyond recognition. It is in this context, this collision between monastic civilization and Viking expansion, between the ordered world of the scriptorium and the sudden catastrophic violence of raid and conquest, that a crypt was sealed, forgotten, and eventually rediscovered. The site is a small, largely unremarked church in the rural interior of Northumberland, its current structure dating in its visible form to the Norman period, but built, as is typical of Norman ecclesiastical construction in England, on and around earlier foundations. During restoration work undertaken in the latter half of the 20th century, the specific date varies depending on the source, and the full excavation report has not been made publicly available in its entirety. Workers uncovered beneath the nave a crypt of earlier construction, pre-Norman, possibly pre-Viking in its original form, though subsequently modified. Inside the crypt, arranged along the walls and in a central deposit on the floor, were the skeletal remains of 11 individuals, adult males by physical assessment. Robust bone structure consistent with the kind of sustained physical labor and dietary patterns typical of early medieval monastic communities. Buried in what appeared to be the remnants of woolen garments, the textile too degraded for detailed analysis, but present in sufficient quantity to indicate deliberate interment in clothing rather than bare deposit. 11 monks, carefully laid, properly buried by every visible indication, with the intention and attention that the period's burial theology demanded. Without their heads. The decapitation is unambiguous in the skeletal record. The cervical vertebrae of each individual show clean, precise separation, in most cases at the same vertebral level, with blade mark characteristics consistent with a single-edged implement applied with significant force and apparent skill. This was not the rough, multiple-blow decapitation typical of battlefield killing. The cut pattern, in the cases where it is most clearly preserved, suggests a practiced hand, a deliberate, controlled act performed with specific intent. The heads themselves are absent, not displaced within the crypt, not buried separately nearby, not present in any form that the excavation identified. They were removed from the site entirely, at or near the time of death, and taken somewhere that has not been found. The mainstream historical interpretation reaches, as it did in Iona, for the Vikings. Decapitation was a documented element of Norse raid violence, and the taking of heads carried specific cultural significance in the Norse world. As trophies, as demonstrations of martial dominance, as objects with possible ritual value in certain Norse religious contexts. An attack on a Northumbrian monastic community during the peak period of Viking activity in the region, resulting in the killing of 11 monks by decapitation and the subsequent careful burial of their headless remains by survivors, is a historically coherent narrative. It is also, on closer examination, one that raises more questions than it resolves. The burial itself is the first difficulty. The crypt in which the remains were found was not a pre-existing space that survivors simply used for emergency internment. It shows evidence of deliberate construction, or at minimum deliberate modification, that appears contemporaneous with the burial deposit. Someone invested significant effort in creating or adapting this space specifically to receive these remains. That is not the behavior of a traumatized community conducting hasty burials in the immediate aftermath of a raid. It is the behavior of people with time, resources, and a specific intention regarding these particular dead. The second difficulty is the arrangement. The 11 bodies are not deposited randomly or even in the practical rows typical of emergency burial. They are positioned in a configuration that several analysts have described as spatially deliberate, a pattern that, when mapped, suggests a relationship between the individual placements that goes beyond the logistics of fitting 11 bodies into a confined space. Whether that pattern carries symbolic or ritual meaning, and within which tradition, has not been formally proposed in any available publication. The third detail is the most quietly persistent. Among the remains beneath the central deposit on the crypt floor, excavators found a flat stone, unmarked on its visible face. But when lifted, and the excavation notes record that it was lifted and that what was found beneath it was documented, the underside bore a carved inscription. The inscription has been described, in the limited secondary references that mention it, as neither Latin nor Old English, nor Old Norse. The characters are described as regular, deeply incised, and organized in a linear sequence, consistent with intentional writing rather than decorative marking. No translation, attempted or successful, appears in any document that has been made available for public or academic review. 11 headless monks, arranged with intention, sealed beneath a stone carrying words no one has published, in a crypt that someone built specifically to hold them. In a landscape that passed through Viking hands and Norman hands and the long, normalizing passage of English centuries without anyone, until a 20th century restoration project broke through the floor, knowing they were there. The heads that were taken from that crypt have never been found. The inscription on the stone beneath the central deposit has never been formally read. And the crypt, having given up what it contained, offers no indication of why those 11 men, of all the dead of Northumbria's violent centuries, were the ones someone chose to seal away with such elaborate, enduring care. Beneath a Northumbrian church, 11 headless monks were sealed into a crypt with deliberate care, beneath a stone carrying an inscription that no one has formally attempted to translate. The heads were taken, the words were left, and the space between those two facts, between what was removed and what was preserved, suggests a purpose that our current historical frameworks have not found adequate language to describe. Decapitation, as we have seen, is not simply a method of killing. Across the ancient and early medieval world, the separation of head from body carried meaning that went beyond the physical act. It appears in ritual contexts, in judicial contexts, in military contexts, and in contexts that resist clean categorization, where the boundaries between those three domains blur in ways that the societies practicing them may not have experienced as distinct at all. The head was, in many early medieval belief systems, the seat of identity, of spiritual presence, of the animating force that connected a person to whatever lay beyond this world. To control the head was, in some sense, to control what the person became after death. That belief, or something structurally similar to it, appears to have been operating with considerable sophistication in a field in central Poland. In a discovery that shares enough with the Northumbrian crypt to make the parallel uncomfortable and differs from it in enough ways to make it, in some respects, even harder to explain. We move east now, across the North Sea and the Baltic, into the flat agricultural heartland of Central Europe, to the Kuyavian-Pomeranian region of what is now north-central Poland, a landscape of low glacial hills, river valleys, and deep agricultural soil that has been farmed continuously since the Neolithic period and has yielded, over the centuries of that continuous cultivation, an extraordinary and sometimes deeply strange archaeological record. It was in this landscape, during construction or agricultural work. The specific circumstances of the initial discovery vary across the sources that describe it. That a site was identified containing a burial deposit unlike anything in the regional archaeological record. A deposit that has been excavated, analyzed, and published in sufficient detail to be academically established as real, while simultaneously resisting every interpretive framework that has been applied to it with complete satisfaction. The site contains the remains of a group of individuals. Estimates range between 12 and 17, depending on the analysis consulted. Arranged not in rows, not in the overlapping informality of mass burial, but in a circle. A deliberate, geometrically coherent circle, the bodies positioned at regular intervals around a central point, oriented with their feet toward the center and their bodies extending outward like the spokes of a wheel pressed into the earth. Every individual in the circle had been decapitated, and in every case the skull had been repositioned, not removed from the site as in Northumbria, but placed, deliberately, carefully, either between the individual's legs, at their feet, or resting on their chest. Each skull in a slightly different position, but each placement clearly intentional. Each head returned to its body, but not to its natural position. Moved. Repositioned with a specificity that implies a system, a set of rules governing where each head should go, that the arrangement itself does not make transparent. The osteological analysis of the remains places the burial in the early medieval period, broadly consistent with the 10th to 12th centuries AD, a period in Polish history characterized by the consolidation of the Piast dynasty, the formal Christianization of the Polish state beginning in 966 AD, and the complex, often violent negotiation between incoming Christian institutional authority and the deeply rooted pre-Christian Slavic belief systems that Christianity was progressively displacing. That historical context is where mainstream archaeological interpretation begins, and it is a genuinely productive starting point. The practice of deviant burial, the interment of individuals in non-standard positions or configurations, is well documented across early medieval Europe as a response to specific categories of social or spiritual anxiety. People believed to be at risk of returning from the dead, the suspected undead, the excommunicated, those who died in circumstances considered spiritually dangerous, were sometimes buried with physical modifications intended to prevent their return. Decapitation and the repositioning of the skull is among the most commonly documented of these practices, found at sites across England, Scandinavia, and Central Europe in exactly the period represented at the Polish site. Under this interpretation, the circle at the Polish site represents a community's response to a group of individuals whose deaths or whose lives generated sufficient spiritual anxiety to warrant extraordinary burial treatment. The circular arrangement itself might reflect a containment strategy, a geometric logic of enclosure intended to prevent the spiritual force of the group from dispersing outward into the surrounding landscape. It is a coherent interpretation. It is supported by genuine comparative evidence, and it accounts for the decapitation and skull repositioning within a framework that requires no assumptions beyond what early medieval Slavic and Christian belief systems are documented to have contained. But it does not account for the circle's geometry. The precision of the spacing between individuals, consistent to a degree that suggests measurement rather than approximation, implies a level of planning and execution that goes beyond the pragmatic, anxious burial of community members who needed to be contained. This is not the hastily performed deviant burial typical of individual cases documented across the period. It is a coordinated, spatially organized event that required preparation, shared understanding of the intended configuration, and the simultaneous or near-simultaneous placement of multiple bodies by multiple people working to a common design. Nor does the mainstream interpretation fully account for the demographic profile of the buried individuals. Unlike the Visigothic wells, where demographic sorting suggested selective accumulation over time, the Polish circle appears to represent a single depositional event, all the individuals placed at approximately the same time in a single organized act. The age and sex profile of the group is mixed, spanning what appears to be a genuine cross-section of a community rather than a selected subset. And there is no evidence of the violence that typically accompanies execution burial. No blade marks on the cervical vertebrae consistent with the forceful, single-blow decapitation of live individuals. The cut patterns are clean, controlled, and post-mortem in character. These people were not executed and then buried. They died, by means that the skeletal record does not reveal, and were then decapitated, their heads repositioned according to a specific system and arranged in a precise geometric formation in a field that, as far as current survey indicates, had no prior ritual or funerary significance. By whom? Under what authority? According to what belief system specific enough to produce this level of organized, deliberate execution of a complex spatial design? These are questions that the published analysis raises and does not resolve. At the center of the circle, the point toward which all those repositioned skulls were oriented, there is nothing. No object, no burial, no structural feature of any kind. Just earth. Whether the center was always empty, whether the circle was complete in itself, its meaning residing in the arrangement rather than in any central focal point, or whether whatever once occupied that position was removed before or after burial, is unknown. 12 to 17 individuals, arranged with geometric precision around an empty center in a field in central Poland, during a period when the old beliefs were being systematically replaced by new ones. The old beliefs did not go quietly, and whatever was performed in that field, whatever understanding of death and the dead and the space between them, motivated the people who dug those graves and repositioned those skulls with such careful, deliberate purpose. It has not yet been recovered. The circle remains. The center remains empty. And the question of what was meant to be there, or what was taken away, remains without an answer that satisfies. A circle of carefully arranged dead, oriented around an empty center, in a field in central Poland. The geometry precise. The intent unmistakable. The meaning unreachable. Whatever occupied that center, whatever belief or presence or object the arrangement was designed to contain, honor, or protect against, was either never there in physical form, or was removed by hands that left no record of the taking. It is a recurring motif in this exploration, the deliberate creation of a space around an absence, architecture organized not around what is present, but around what is not. Sealed doors, empty centers, unread inscriptions, heads that were taken and heads that were repositioned, and wells filled with sordid bones, and an unmarked winter in a monastic record that should have been full of words. What we are tracing across these sites and centuries is something that resists a single name. It is not simply the mystery of what happened, it is the mystery of what was intended. The sense, persistent and unsettling, that the people who created these spaces understood something about death, about the boundary between the living world and whatever lies beyond it, about the relationship between geometry and spiritual force, that we have lost, or never had, or have not yet recovered. And nowhere is that sense more concentrated, more architecturally elaborated, or more historically layered than in the ground beneath one of the ancient world's most consequential cities. We move south now, across the Mediterranean, to the northern coast of Africa, to a low promontory of land extending into the sea on the eastern side of what is now the Gulf of Tunis, in modern Tunisia, to a site that was, for several centuries, the center of one of the most powerful civilizations the ancient Mediterranean produced. A city that challenged Rome for dominance of the known world, that sent armies across the Alps, that controlled trade routes stretching from the Atlantic coast of Morocco to the eastern shores of what is now Libya, and that was, in the end, destroyed so completely and so deliberately by its Roman conquerors that the destruction itself became a byword for annihilation. Carthage. Founded, according to tradition, by Phoenician settlers from the city of Tyre, in what is now Lebanon, on the coast of the ancient Levant. Sometime around the late 9th century BC, Carthage grew from a trading post into an empire over the course of several centuries. At its height, it was a city of perhaps 500,000 people, its harbors among the most sophisticated maritime infrastructure in the ancient world, its commercial network extending across the entire western Mediterranean basin and beyond. The Carthaginian pantheon, headed by the god Baal-Hamon and the goddess Tenet, shaped every aspect of civic and private life, and the religious architecture of the city was, by all ancient accounts, elaborate, extensive, and in certain respects, deeply unsettling to outside observers. Rome destroyed Carthage in 146 BC at the conclusion of the Third Punic War, with a thoroughness that was deliberate and documented. The city was burned, its population killed or enslaved, its physical fabric demolished. Later Roman Carthage, rebuilt on the same site beginning in the 1st century BC and eventually becoming the third largest city in the Roman Empire, was constructed directly over the ruins of its Punic predecessor, using Punic foundations, Punic substructures, and in some cases, Punic underground spaces that the Roman builders chose to incorporate rather than eliminate. It is in those incorporated underground spaces, excavated and documented across more than a century of archaeological work on the site, that something has been found that the formal literature describes with a careful restraint that itself communicates the difficulty of the material. Beneath a section of the Roman city in the area archaeologists designate as the Punic residential and religious quarter, a subterranean space was identified during excavations that have been ongoing, in various phases, since the late 19th century. The space is not a tomb, it is not a cistern or a drainage feature or a storage facility. The functional underground infrastructure of Punic and Roman Carthage is well documented, and this space does not conform to any of those typologies. It is a chamber, roughly rectangular, with walls that bear evidence of having been plastered and painted at some point in their history. The paint now largely deteriorated, but present in sufficient remnant quantity to indicate that the space was finished, prepared for use, rather than merely constructed. The chamber contained, when first formally documented, an assemblage of objects and features that excavation reports describe in aggregate, but have not, as a collection, been the subject of a dedicated published analysis. Individually, the elements are familiar from Punic religious contexts. A stone platform or altar feature, low and flat, positioned toward one end of the chamber. Ceramic vessels of types associated with votive deposit in Punic sanctuary contexts. Carbonized organic material, burnt offerings in the assessment of the excavators, in concentrations around the altar feature. And on the walls, in the remnant plaster, painted figures that the available descriptions characterize as consistent with Punic religious iconography, centered on imagery associated with Tanit, a Punic shrine, underground beneath a residential quarter, private or semi-private in its scale and access. Not unusual in itself, domestic and neighborhood shrines are documented across the Punic world, and their underground placement in Carthage reflects both the density of the urban fabric above and the theological significance of subterranean space in Punic religious practice. What places this particular shrine outside the standard typological framework is not any single feature, but the condition of its abandonment. The shrine was not simply decommissioned, it was not cleared of its contents and repurposed, as happened routinely with religious spaces that fell out of use across the ancient world. It was abandoned in use, or immediately after use, with its votive vessels in place, its burnt offerings uncleared, its altar feature undisturbed. And it was then sealed. Not by Roman construction above it, which came later and which sealed it incidentally. It was sealed before the Romans arrived, by the deliberate placement of stone and rubble fill in its entrance passage, in a pattern consistent with intentional closure rather than structural collapse. Someone sealed this shrine while it still contained its offerings, while the evidence of its most recent use was still present and undisturbed. They closed it, filled the entrance, and left everything inside exactly as it was. The question that no published analysis has formally answered is why. The fall of Carthage in 146 BC provides an obvious historical frame, a community facing annihilation, sealing its sacred spaces to protect them from Roman desecration, preserving in the earth what could not be preserved above it. That interpretation is emotionally and historically resonant, and it may be correct. But the ceramic assemblage within the shrine has been dated, by the excavators, to a period preceding the final destruction, by a margin that several analysts have noted is difficult to account for under the emergency sealing hypothesis. The shrine appears to have been abandoned and sealed not in the chaos of 146 BC, but earlier, perhaps significantly earlier, during a period when Carthage was still intact, still functioning, still capable of maintaining its religious institutions in the normal course of civic life. Which means the sealing was not an act of preservation under threat. It was a choice, made by someone for reasons, at a moment when alternatives existed. What happened in that chamber that made continued use impossible, or undesirable, or dangerous? What was experienced or witnessed or performed there that prompted the decision to close it, fill the entrance, and walk away, leaving the offerings exactly where they lay? Is a question that the shrine itself, in its careful, undisturbed stillness beneath 2,000 years of accumulated city, does not answer. Tanit's painted image remains on the deteriorating plaster. The vessels remain in their positions. The ash of the last burnt offering remains where it fell, and the entrance remains filled, as it was left, by people who had reasons we have not recovered for making certain that whatever the shrine had become, whatever it had witnessed or contained or been used for, would remain permanently and completely underground. Beneath Carthage, a shrine was sealed mid-offering, the ash of the last burnt sacrifice left undisturbed, the vessels left in place, the painted image of Tanit left watching over a space that someone, for reasons we have not recovered, decided should never be used again. It is an act of finality so deliberate, so composed, that it carries the quality not of emergency, but of conclusion. Someone reached a decision about that shrine, about what it had become, or what had happened within it, and acted on that decision with a thoroughness that 2,000 years of accumulated city above it could not undo. There is a category of human experience that the ancient world returned to repeatedly, across cultures and geographies and centuries, that our own era tends to approach with a mixture of clinical detachment and quiet unease. The experience of the sacred made dangerous, the holy place that crosses a threshold, the route to the divine that begins to take from the people who travel it rather than giving to them. The pilgrimage that does not return its pilgrims. It is, on its surface, a theological concept. But it has a physical record. And that record, in the case of what we examine next, is written not in stone or bone or sealed chambers, but in absence, in the gaps of a documentary trail that stretches across one of the most traversed and most documented pilgrimage corridors in the ancient and medieval world, the Sinai Peninsula, a roughly triangular wedge of land connecting the African continent to Asia, bounded by the Gulf of Suez to the west and the Gulf of Aqaba to the east, its interior dominated by a mountainous core of granite and sandstone that rises to over 2,000 meters at its southern apex. It is, geologically, one of the oldest exposed rock formations on Earth. Ecologically, it is among the most extreme environments in which human beings have chosen to live, travel, and seek the presence of the divine. They have been doing so for a very long time. The Sinai's sacred geography is among the most densely layered in the world. Ancient Egyptian turquoise and copper mining operations penetrated its western ranges as early as the 3rd millennium BC, accompanied by religious installations dedicated to the goddess Hathor. The peninsula's central and southern massif is identified in the Abrahamic tradition as the location of the divine revelation to Moses. The mountain called Sinai, or Horeb, its precise identification debated by scholars for centuries, but its theological significance undiminished by that uncertainty. The monastery of St. Catherine, established at the foot of the traditional Mount Sinai in the 6th century AD by the Emperor Justinian, became one of the most important pilgrimage destinations in the Christian world and remains, to this day, the oldest continuously inhabited Christian monastery on Earth. The pilgrimage route through the Sinai, connecting the populated regions of the Nile Delta and the Palestinian coast to the sacred sites of the southern peninsula, was one of the most consistently traveled corridors in the ancient and medieval Mediterranean world. It was documented by Egyptian administrators, by Byzantine ecclesiastical authorities, by Arab geographers, by Crusader cartographers, and by the monastery of St. Catherine itself, whose records of pilgrims received and pilgrims departed constitute one of the most continuous documentary series in medieval pilgrimage history. It is within that documentary series, precisely because it is so continuous, so carefully maintained, so unusually complete for its period, that a pattern becomes visible that the monastery's own archivists noted in the careful language of medieval ecclesiastical record-keeping, without explanation. Groups of pilgrims who entered the Sinai from the northern routes, from the direction of the Palestinian coastal plain and the Negev, and who were documented at waypoints along the route, did not always arrive at St. Catherine's. Not occasionally, not rarely, but in clusters. In specific decades across the Byzantine and early Arab periods, the arrival records at the monastery show a deficit that the departure records from northern waypoints do not account for. Pilgrims signed out. Pilgrims were noted at intermediate stops. Pilgrims did not arrive. The mainstream historical explanations are well-grounded and genuinely applicable. The Sinai route was dangerous. Bedouin raiding was a persistent reality for pilgrims traveling through the peninsula, documented extensively in both Byzantine and Arab sources. The terrain was unforgiving. The granite massif of the southern Sinai offers little water, extreme temperature variation, and navigation challenges that could be fatal to groups that lost their way or were separated from experienced guides. Disease, dehydration, and exhaustion claimed pilgrims on every major medieval pilgrimage route, and the Sinai's extreme environment made it more lethal than most. All of this is true. All of it is documented, and none of it quite accounts for the specific pattern in the records. Because the disappearances are not evenly distributed, they cluster, in particular decades affecting particular routes with a consistency that suggests not the random attrition of difficult travel, but something more localized, more specific. The groups that disappear in the documentary record are not scattered randomly across the full span of the journey. They are last documented at a relatively consistent geographic point, a section of the route through a specific valley system in the central Sinai Massif, known in medieval Arab geographical literature by a name that translates, with variations across sources, as something approximating the Valley of the Returning Sound, or the Valley of the Echo. No modern geographical survey has definitively identified this valley with a specific location in the current Sinai topography. The medieval Arab geographical tradition that names it is itself fragmentary, and the name appears in only a small number of sources, always in passing, never as the subject of extended description. What those passing references do preserve, in language that the writers treat as unremarkable, as established, known fact rather than remarkable claim, is a consistent association between this section of the route and the experience of disorientation. Travelers who entered the valley and attempted to navigate by sound reported that sound behaved incorrectly, that echoes returned from directions inconsistent with the terrain, that voices seemed to come from locations where no person was present, that groups became separated in conditions of visibility that should have made separation impossible. The geological explanation for acoustic anomalies in granite canyon systems is real and well documented. Sound behavior in enclosed rock formations can be profoundly disorienting, producing exactly the kind of directional confusion the medieval sources describe. A group of pilgrims, already exhausted and navigating unfamiliar terrain, experiencing significant acoustic disorientation in a canyon system with limited egress points, could become dangerously lost through entirely natural means. That explanation accounts for the experience. It does not fully account for the scale of the disappearances in the cluster years, nor for the specificity with which the documentary record points to this section of the route, rather than distributing the deficit more evenly across the journey's hazards. Some researchers working with the St. Catherine's archive material have noted that the monastery's own records contain, in the correspondence of several successive abbots during the peak disappearance periods, references to investigations conducted, guides sent back along the route, inquiries made at Bedouin settlements, letters dispatched to ecclesiastical authorities in Palestine requesting information about groups that had departed and never arrived. Those investigations, as far as the surviving record indicates, produced nothing. No remains were found. No witnesses came forward. No explanation was offered that satisfied the abbots who commissioned the inquiries, because the inquiries themselves appear in the correspondence to simply stop. Not concluded, not resolved, discontinued. As though whatever the investigations encountered, or failed to encounter, in that valley system in the central Sinai, was not something that the language of Byzantine ecclesiastical correspondence had adequate words for. The Valley of the Returning Sound, the Valley of the Echo, a section of ancient granite canyon where sound comes back from the wrong direction, and where pilgrims, in specific and documented clusters across 2 centuries of careful record-keeping, walked in and did not walk out. Whether the terrain took them, as it takes all things eventually given sufficient time and exposure, or whether something more specific, more localized, more resistant to natural explanation was operating in that section of the route, the Sinai has not said. It keeps its secrets the way desert always does. Not with drama, not with locked doors or sealed inscriptions, simply by being what it is, vast, indifferent, and old beyond the reach of any record that human hands have made. The pilgrims who entered that valley and did not arrive at St. Catherine's are, in the documentary record, simply absent. No graves, no accounts, no final entries. Just the desert, and the sound coming back from the wrong direction, and the silence that follows when you stop and listen for what should be there. The Sinai keeps its silence the way only ancient desert can, not as absence, but as weight. The pilgrims who entered that valley and did not emerge left no graves, no final words, no thread of explanation that the most diligent Byzantine abbots could follow to its end. The desert simply received them, as it has received everything that has passed through it across the millennia, and offered nothing back. But silence, as we have seen throughout this exploration, is rarely total. It tends to have a texture, a quality, and sometimes in the places where human beings have concentrated their deepest beliefs and their most sustained spiritual attention over the longest periods of time, silence gives way to something that is almost, but not quite, its opposite. Sound without source, voice, without speaker. The auditory equivalent of the locked door in the sealed shrine, something present that should not be, something perceived that cannot be located, something that arrives from the boundary between the known world and whatever lies adjacent to it. We encountered it in the whispering caverns of Cyrene, where carved channels produced acoustic phenomena that researchers documented with careful restraint. We heard its echo in the valley of the returning sound, where pilgrims lost their bearings and did not return. We meet it again now, in a more specific, more extensively documented, and in certain respects more deeply unsettling form, at a site in southwestern Turkey that was, for several centuries of the ancient world, considered one of the most sacred and spiritually charged locations in the entire Greek-speaking world. The site is Lagina, a sanctuary site in the region of ancient Caria, located in what is now the Mala province of southwestern Turkey, roughly 30 kilometers from the ancient city of Stratonikeia, with which it maintained a close administrative and religious relationship. The sanctuary was dedicated to Hecate, one of the most complex, most theologically layered, and most persistently misunderstood deities in the ancient Greek pantheon. Hecate defies simple categorization. She is not reducible to the later medieval and early modern caricature of a witch goddess, though that reduction has proven remarkably durable. In the classical Greek tradition, she was a Titan, a pre-Olympian deity of considerable power and ambiguous alignment, claimed by no single domain but present at boundaries. The boundary between night and day, between the living world and the realm of the dead, between the known road and the unmarked crossing. She presided over crossroads, over thresholds, over the transitional moments and spaces where one state of being gives way to another. Her worship was ancient, predating the Olympian tradition in some of its roots, and at Lagina it was practiced with a continuity and an institutional elaboration that suggests the site held significance that went beyond the merely conventional. The temple at Lagina, in its surviving archaeological form, dates primarily to the 2nd and 1st centuries BC. A Hellenistic structure of considerable architectural ambition whose sculptural frieze, now partially preserved, depicts scenes from Greek mythology with a quality of craft that places Lagina among the significant religious sites of the Hellenistic world. The sanctuary complex surrounding the temple included propylaea, a sacred enclosure wall, a ceremonial well, and the remnants of what appear to have been administrative and residential structures associated with the temple's permanent priestly staff. The site was excavated beginning in the late 19th century, with more systematic work continuing through the 20th century and into the present. The archaeological record is substantial. The inscriptional record, dedications, administrative decrees, lists of priestly office holders, is among the richest of any sanctuary site in the region, providing an unusually detailed picture of the cult's organization and the community that sustained it across several centuries. It is in that inscriptional record and in the literary sources that reference Lagina in the context of Hecate's broader cultic significance that the phenomenon begins to surface. Not dramatically, not as the central subject of any single text, but as a recurring matter-of-fact reference that appears across sources spanning several centuries and treating the phenomenon not as remarkable, but as simply characteristic of the place. The ancient sources describe sounds at Lagina, specifically sounds at night. Voices, or voice-like sounds, reported by the sanctuary's priestly staff, by pilgrims staying within the sacred enclosure, and by travelers passing the site after dark. The descriptions are consistent in their broad outlines across the sources that preserve them. Sounds of an apparently human vocal quality, heard in the vicinity of the temple and its sacred enclosure during the night hours, not attributable by those who heard them to any identifiable human or animal source. The Greek and Latin authors who reference these sounds treat them with a theological matter-of-factness that is itself informative. At a sanctuary of Hecate, goddess of thresholds, of the boundary between living and dead, of the night and the crossroads, sounds of ambiguous origin heard in darkness were not a source of public alarm. They were, apparently, expected, incorporated into the site's sacred character, treated as evidence of divine presence in the way that oracular vapors at Delphi or the sacred spring at Dodona were treated, as the physical manifestation of a deity's proximity. Several ancient authors specifically connect the night voices at Lagina to Hecate's role as a psychopomp, a guide of souls between the living world and the realm of the dead. The sounds in this theological framing were the voices of the dead in transit, audible at Lagina because the boundary between worlds was, at this particular point in the landscape, thinner than elsewhere, more permeable. That is a theological interpretation, and it requires no further defense as such. Beliefs about divine presence and spiritual geography were not primitive errors in the ancient world. They were sophisticated, internally coherent frameworks for understanding phenomena that the people experiencing them encountered as real. What makes the Lagina case interesting beyond its theological framing is the consistency and the duration of the reports. The references span from at least the 2nd century BC to the late Roman period, a span of several centuries during which the site changed political hands, experienced periods of enhanced and diminished activity, and was visited by people of widely varying cultural and theological backgrounds. The consistency of the reported phenomenon across that span, through all of those changes, suggests that whatever was being experienced at Lagina was not the product of any single cultural expectation or theological predisposition. Modern acoustic investigation of the site has not been formally conducted in any published form. The geology of the Lagina area, limestone karst formations, subsurface water movement, the particular topography of the valley in which the sanctuary sits, offers potential natural frameworks for acoustic anomalies of various kinds. Wind behavior in enclosed valley systems, subsurface resonance from moving water, the acoustic properties of the sanctuary's stone structures, which create enclosure and reflection effects that would not be present in the open landscape. None of these potential explanations has been applied systematically to the Lagina site. None has been tested against the specific descriptions in the ancient sources to determine whether natural acoustic phenomena could produce what the ancient witnesses describe with sufficient consistency and specificity to be persuasive. In the fringe research space, predictably, the Lagina voices have attracted interpretations ranging from genuine survival of auditory phenomena associated with concentrated long-term ritual activity, a hypothesis that sits at the contested edge of acoustic research, to more speculative proposals involving the site's possible relationship to underground space, to water, and to the broader pattern of threshold sites across the ancient world where acoustic phenomena and sacred geography appear to coincide. That pattern is real, whatever its explanation. We have traced it from Cyrene to the Sinai, from the whispering channels of the necropolis to the disorienting canyons of the desert. And here at Lagina, it finds its most theologically explicit ancient articulation, a site where the voices were not merely reported, but expected, not merely heard but interpreted, not merely experienced but incorporated into the fabric of a living religious tradition that used them as evidence of exactly the kind of boundary that the goddess of thresholds was believed to inhabit. Hecate's temple still stands, in partial form, in the valley at Lagina. The stones that witness several centuries of nocturnal acoustic experience remain in their positions. The inscriptions that record the names of priests who served through the night watches remain legible. Whether the valley still produces, under the right conditions, the sounds that those priests recorded and interpreted and built their theological understanding around, whether the acoustic character of the landscape that made Lagina sacred persists beneath the silence of a site that is no longer actively worshipped, is a question that no researcher has yet formally gone there in the dark to answer. And perhaps that restraint is understandable, because at a sanctuary specifically dedicated to the goddess of thresholds, the question of what you might hear if you listened carefully enough at the boundary of night and silence is one that carries, even now, a quality of invitation that it is entirely reasonable to decline. At Lagina, the invitation to listen at the threshold of night and silence is one that reasonable caution declines. The valley keeps its acoustic character, whatever it is, whatever it produces under the right atmospheric conditions, And the question of what the priests who served through those night watches actually heard remains, as so many questions in this exploration have remained, formally unanswered. There is something fitting about ending our time at Lagina with restraint, because the goddess whose sanctuary it was, Hecate, deity of thresholds and transitions, and the spaces between defined states, understood in the theology her worshippers built around her that boundaries are not simply lines, they are zones, spaces of indeterminate character where the rules of one realm have loosened and the rules of the next have not yet fully taken hold. Liminal spaces, places where what is normally fixed becomes, briefly and vertiginously, uncertain. Water is the oldest liminal space. Before architecture, before inscription, before the carved channel and the sealed door and the repositioned skull, human beings understood water as boundary. The surface of a lake, the edge of a marsh, the place where solid ground gives way to something that will neither fully support you nor fully release you. These have been threshold spaces in human symbolic geography since before writing existed to record the fact. And in the cultures that grew up along the edges of the Baltic Sea, that understanding was not metaphor. It was engineering. They built for the threshold. They built on it, in it, and ultimately beneath it. We move north now, into the flat, lake-scattered lowlands that border the southern and eastern edges of the Baltic Sea. Into a landscape that was, across the late Iron Age and early medieval period, home to a complex of Germanic, Slavic, and Baltic cultures whose burial practices were among the most elaborate, most materially rich, and in certain respects most archaeologically puzzling in northern Europe. A landscape where the distinction between land and water has always been provisional, where marshes extend into meadows, where lakes edge into bogs, where the ground underfoot carries, even in summer, the memory of the water that once covered it and will, given sufficient time and shifting conditions, cover it again. It is in this landscape, specifically in the marshy lowlands of what is now northern Poland, the Kaliningrad region of Russia, and the coastal areas of Lithuania and Latvia, that archaeological survey and occasional accidental discovery have, over the course of the last century, revealed a phenomenon that the regional archaeological literature documents with careful factuality, and that the broader academic world has engaged with only partially and unevenly. Burial ships. Not the celebrated ship burials of Scandinavia. The Oseberg ship, the Sutton Hoo vessel, which were interred in visible mounds above the waterline and have been excavated, studied, and placed within a well-developed interpretive framework. These are different. These are ships, or the structural remains of vessels, found not in burial mounds but in the marshes themselves. Beneath the waterlogged peat, in the transitional zone between solid ground and open water, where the preservation conditions created by anaerobic acidic bog chemistry have maintained organic materials that would have disappeared completely in any drier environment. The discoveries have been made incrementally, without the fanfare that accompanied the great Scandinavian ship burial excavations. A timber frame encountered during drainage work. A clinker-built hull section exposed by a shifting marsh boundary. Structural elements identified during agricultural improvement projects in the early and mid-20th century, noted in regional archaeological reports, and in several cases not followed up with the systematic excavation that their significance warranted. What has been recovered and documented is sufficient to establish several things with reasonable confidence. The vessels are real. They are of varying size and construction, some relatively small, consistent with river or coastal craft, others suggesting larger seagoing capability. They date, in the cases where dating has been conducted, to a broad period spanning roughly the 5th through 11th centuries AD, and they contain, in the cases where the interior deposits have been examined, human remains. In several instances, multiple individuals. In at least one documented case, the skeletal remains of what appears to have been a complete crew complement, or something approximating one. The mainstream interpretive framework for Baltic marsh ship burials draws on the well-documented tradition of water deposition in northern European prehistoric and early medieval practice. Votive offerings to water, weapons, ornaments, foodstuffs, and occasionally human sacrifices are among the most consistently documented ritual behaviors across the Germanic, Slavic, and Baltic cultural zones throughout the Iron Age and into the medieval period. The placing of the dead in water or at the water's edge reflects theological frameworks in which water served as the boundary through which the dead passed into their next existence. The liminal zone made literal, the threshold physically traversed. Under this interpretation, the Baltic marsh ships are elaborate versions of a practice that is well attested in simpler forms throughout the region. The vessel as vehicle for the final journey, the marsh as gateway, the deliberate placement of the dead in their ship at the boundary between the world of the living and whatever lies beyond the water's surface. That framework is coherent and evidentially grounded. It accounts for the basic facts of what has been found. But several features of the Baltic marsh ship deposits have generated, in the researchers who have examined them most closely, a set of questions that the votive deposition framework does not fully absorb. The first is the concealment. The Scandinavian ship burial tradition is monumental. The mound raised over the interred vessel is a statement of status, of commemoration, of the community's relationship to its significant dead. It is designed to be seen. The Baltic marsh ships, by contrast, appear to have been placed specifically in locations and conditions where they would not be seen. Not simply buried, but hidden, positioned in the deepest, most inaccessible sections of the marshy terrain, in locations that would have required deliberate effort to reach, and that would have offered, after the interment was complete, no visible surface feature to mark the spot. This is not commemoration. It is concealment. And the distinction matters because it implies a different relationship between the community and its dead, or between the community and whatever it was placing in the marsh, than the monumental burial tradition exhibits. The second feature is the cargo. In several of the marsh ship deposits alongside the human remains, excavators have documented objects that do not conform to the standard typology of grave goods in the regional tradition. Not the weapons, ornaments, and domestic equipment typical of high-status burial. Instead, objects of ambiguous function, wooden structures of uncertain purpose, bound assemblages of organic material whose composition has been analyzed but whose significance has not been determined. And in one documented case, a cache of carved items bearing markings that the excavation report describes, with a restraint that speaks volumes as not matching any identified runic or symbolic tradition of the region. We have encountered that phrase before. Markings that match nothing identified. In the Visigothic wells, in the Northumbrian crypt, in the carved channels of Derinkuyu, symbols that someone made with evident intention and that no published scholarship has formally claimed to read. The third feature is the most difficult to place within any available framework. In at least 3 of the documented marsh ship deposits, sites separated by considerable geographic distance within the Baltic lowland region, the human remains show evidence of having been arranged post-mortem in a configuration that mirrors, with unsettling precision, the circular arrangement we encountered in the Polish burial field. Not identical in its specifics. The scale is different, the spatial constraints of a ship interior produce a different geometry, but structurally analogous. Bodies positioned in relationship to a central point. Heads in 2 of the 3 cases, repositioned after decapitation, placed according to a logic that the arrangement suggests but does not reveal. A pattern, in other words, not confined to a single site or a single cultural context, but appearing across different burial forms, different geographic locations, different temporal periods, always with the same structural elements. The circle, the center, the repositioned head, the unidentified markings, the deliberate concealment. Whether that pattern represents the persistence of a specific belief system that moved through Northern and Central European cultures leaving these archaeological traces, or whether it represents independent convergence on similar ritual solutions to similar theological problems, or whether it points to something else entirely. A connection between these sites that current archaeological frameworks do not have adequate tools to map is a question that the evidence raises with a consistency that is, by this point in the exploration, impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Beneath the Baltic marshes, in the waterlogged dark where preservation conditions have maintained what drier ground would long since have destroyed, the ships wait. Most of them unexcavated, some of them unsurveyed, an unknown number of them still undiscovered, held in the anaerobic patience of the peat, carrying whatever they carried to the threshold and whatever answers those cargoes might provide. The water keeps what the land releases, and in the flat, gray, sky-reflecting marshes of the Baltic lowlands, the threshold between what we know and what remains hidden is, as it has always been in this landscape, precisely where the solid ground ends, and the surface of the water begins. Beneath the Baltic marshes, the ships wait in their patient, waterlogged dark, carrying their cargoes of arranged dead and unidentified markings and structural echoes of patterns we have encountered before. The circle, the center, the repositioned head, to a threshold that the peat has sealed with a thoroughness that only anaerobic chemistry and the slow accumulation of centuries can produce. They are there, most of them untouched, and the questions they carry will remain unanswered for as long as the marshes hold them. There is a particular kind of historical silence that water produces. It preserves and conceals simultaneously, maintaining the physical evidence with extraordinary fidelity while placing it beyond reach, beneath a surface that gives nothing away. The Baltic marshes keep their secrets in the cold and the dark, and they keep them completely. But water is not the only keeper. Desert keeps too. Differently, through desiccation rather than saturation, through the absence of the biological processes that consume organic material in wetter climates, through the sheer inhospitality that discourages the continuous human occupation that elsewhere buries the past under the weight of the present. The desert does not accumulate. It preserves. And what it preserves, it tends to preserve whole. Which is why, in a stretch of the Negev desert, in the southern reaches of the ancient Palestinian landscape, a city stands that should not, by any ordinary measure of historical survival, be standing. Not as ruins in the conventional sense. Collapsed walls, scattered foundations, the fragmentary evidence of former habitation that most ancient sites present to the archaeologist's eye. But as something considerably more complete than that. More intact. More, in a word that keeps surfacing in the accounts of researchers who work there, unsettling. Shivta. Known in ancient sources by variants of its Nabatean and Byzantine names, situated in the central Negev highlands at an elevation of approximately 350 meters above sea level, roughly 40 kilometers southwest of the modern city of Beersheba. It is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, part of the designation that covers the Negev's ancient agricultural and settlement landscape. It has been surveyed, mapped, and studied by archaeologists since the late 19th century. Its general historical outline is established and not seriously disputed. What is disputed, or more precisely, what is acknowledged in the academic literature and left, with a quietness that has the quality of institutional discomfort without satisfying resolution, is why it looks the way it does. Shivta was inhabited continuously from approximately the 1st century BC through to sometime in the 7th or 8th century AD, a span of roughly 7 to 8 centuries during which it functioned as a prosperous agricultural and trading community, sustained by an extraordinarily sophisticated water harvesting system that collected and channeled the Negev's minimal rainfall with an efficiency that modern engineers have studied with genuine admiration. At its height during the Byzantine period, it supported a population estimated at several thousand people, maintained 3 churches of considerable architectural ambition, and participated in the regional economy through wine production and trade along the routes connecting the Mediterranean coast to the Arabian Peninsula. And then it was empty. Not gradually empty, in the way that most ancient settlements decline, populations seeping away over generations as economic conditions shift. Agricultural capacity diminishes, political authority withdraws, leaving behind a slow accumulation of disrepair and abandonment that the archaeological record reflects as a gradual transition. Shivta's abandonment does not look like that. It looks, to the researchers who have examined the stratigraphic and material evidence most carefully, like something considerably more abrupt. The buildings are intact, not merely structurally present, but functionally complete. Roofs collapsed by time and seismic activity, but walls standing to significant heights, doorways preserved, interior spaces coherent. The water systems that sustain the city are not the degraded remnants of infrastructure that fell into disrepair as population declined. They are complete systems, in many sections still functional, showing no evidence of the progressive deterioration that would accompany a slow population decline over multiple generations. The churches contain their architectural features in states of preservation that reflect not gradual decay, but sudden cessation. Mosaic floors, carved stone liturgical furniture, painted plaster in the apse regions of 2 of the 3 church buildings, the imagery partially preserved, as though the painters simply stopped one day and did not return. There is no destruction layer, no evidence of violent assault, no burned structural timbers, no weapons, no skeletal remains in positions consistent with conflict mortality, no the kind of archaeological signature that military violence leaves in the site record. Shifta was not attacked. It was not burned. It was not conquered and destroyed. It was left. With its buildings standing, its water systems intact, its churches decorated and furnished, and its streets, as far as the excavation record indicates, simply emptied of the people who had filled them. The mainstream historical explanation situates the abandonment within the broad context of the Islamic conquest of the Levant in the 630s and 640s AD, and the subsequent economic and demographic reorganization of the region that followed the transition from Byzantine to Umayyad governance. Trade route realignments, agricultural policy changes, and the gradual depopulation of the Byzantine-era Negev settlements are documented trends across the region in this period. Shifta, under this interpretation, was one of many Negev towns whose economic rationale diminished under the new political order, leading its population to relocate to more economically viable centers over the course of a generation or 2. That interpretation is historically reasonable. It fits the broad regional pattern. And it does not fit Shifta's specific archaeological profile, because the regional Negev settlements that were abandoned gradually in this period show the archaeological signature of gradual abandonment, the removal of valuables, the reuse of building materials, the partial demolition of structures whose stones were needed elsewhere, the evidence of a population that packed what it could carry and left incrementally over time, making rational decisions about what to take and what to leave. That signature is absent at Shifta. The valuables, to the extent that the site's long exposure to surface survey has left them, were not systematically removed. The building materials were not quarried for reuse elsewhere. The water infrastructure was not dismantled. The population of Shifta, whatever happened, did not leave in the manner of people making an orderly, rational, economically motivated decision to relocate. Several researchers examining the most recent archaeological data from the site have proposed epidemic disease as a more adequate explanation, a pathogen of sufficient lethality and speed to remove the population faster than orderly departure was possible, leaving the city's physical fabric intact because there was no one left to dismantle it and no surviving community nearby with either the capacity or the inclination to quarry its stones. Plague events in the Byzantine Levant are historically documented, and the Justinianic plague of the 6th century AD and its subsequent waves caused demographic catastrophe across the eastern Mediterranean that has been progressively better understood through recent bioarchaeological research. This explanation accounts more adequately for the preservation profile of the site. A community eliminated by rapid epidemic mortality would leave behind exactly the kind of intact, complete, suddenly ceased archaeological signature that Shifta presents. But it produces its own unanswered questions. If plague took Shifta's population, where are the dead? Mass mortality events of epidemic origin leave archaeological traces. Burial grounds overwhelmed by volume, emergency interments in unconventional locations, the physical evidence of bodies that needed to be disposed of faster than existing funerary infrastructure could manage. The area immediately surrounding Shifta has been surveyed. The known burial grounds associated with the settlement do not reflect a mass mortality event. The emergency burial deposits that epidemic scenarios predict have not been found. The people of Shivta are gone. The city they built and maintained across 7 centuries of desert habitation stands in the Negev sun, complete and coherent and empty, offering no explanation for their absence that the evidence so far recovered has been able to confirm. In the late afternoon light, when the angle of the sun catches the standing walls and throws long shadows across the intact street plan of a city that has been waiting in perfect desert preservation for over 1,000 years, Shivta has the quality of a place that was interrupted rather than ended, as though whatever took its people did so between one moment and the next, and left everything else exactly as it was. Shivta stands in the Negev sun, complete and coherent and waiting, its walls intact, its water systems functional, its churches decorated and abandoned mid-gesture, as though the city was interrupted rather than ended. The people are gone, and the dead are not where they should be, and the desert, as it always does, offers the evidence without the explanation, preserving everything except the answer. We have been here before, in this particular quality of absence, at Iona, where the monks disappeared across a single winter without producing a survivor to describe what happened. At Derinkuyu, where whoever sealed the lowest chambers made certain the ceiling could not be undone from within. At Carthage, where the last offering was left in place, and the entrance filled by people who had decided, for reasons we cannot recover, that the shrine was finished. In each case, the physical evidence survives with a completeness that feels almost deliberate, as though whatever force or decision or event produced the abandonment was careful to leave the stage set, the props in place, the scene readable, but the meaning withheld. Shivta adds one further element to that pattern. The missing dead, a community removed faster than its burial infrastructure could accommodate, leaving no mass grave, no emergency interment, no physical accounting for several thousand people who were present, and then were not. It is the most complete version of the disappearance motif we have yet encountered, not just the absence of survivors, but the absence of remains, of any material trace of the biological fact of death. Which brings us, with a directness that is not coincidental, to a phenomenon that was recorded, carefully, repeatedly, and with a clinical specificity unusual for its time and context, by the scribes and physicians of the Syriac Christian monastic tradition, a tradition that was, in the 6th through 9th centuries AD, one of the most intellectually sophisticated and medically advanced in the late antique and early medieval world. A tradition that produced in its monastic libraries and scriptoria some of the most important medical and philosophical texts of the period, and a tradition that documented, in the same careful hand that transcribed Galen and Hippocrates and the works of the Greek philosophical schools, something that those classical sources had not prepared it for. The Syriac monastic world stretched across a vast geographic arc in this period, from the monasteries of the Tur Abdin Plateau in what is now southeastern Turkey, through the communities of the Syrian interior, down through the Palestinian highlands and into the Egyptian desert tradition with which it maintained close intellectual contact. These were not isolated hermitages. They were sophisticated institutions, libraries, schools, hospitals, centers of translation and scholarship that served as the primary transmission belt for Greek classical knowledge into the Arabic intellectual tradition that would eventually inherit and expand it. They were also, by the nature of their geographic distribution and their function as waypoints for travelers, pilgrims, and the sick seeking care, unusually well positioned to observe and document patterns of illness moving through the populations of the late antique Levant and Mesopotamia. It is in the medical and administrative records of several of these communities, records housed in manuscript collections in Rome, London, and Damascus, some published, some in partial translation, some still awaiting scholarly attention, that references to a specific and recurring condition appear. The condition has no single name in the sources, but a cluster of Syriac terms is used across multiple independent documents with sufficient consistency to suggest they are describing the same phenomenon. The most literal translation of the most frequently used term is something approximating shadow illness, or the illness of the shadow, with a secondary semantic range that some translators have rendered as the dimming sickness or the affliction of the half-present. The clinical descriptions in the monastic records are detailed enough to be genuinely informative and strange enough to resist clean mapping onto any single condition in the modern medical literature. The illness appears to have presented in a consistent sequence. The initial phase was characterized by what the sources describe as a withdrawal of the person's ordinary presence. Not loss of consciousness, not fever, not the visible physical deterioration typical of the epidemic diseases the monasteries documented with clinical familiarity. Instead, a quality of progressive absence in a person who remained physically present. Reduced responsiveness, diminished recognition of familiar people and environments, a tendency to orient toward walls, toward corners, toward the peripheral edges of spaces rather than their centers. Behavior that the monastic physicians noted with evident puzzlement as the opposite of what organic neurological decline typically produced. The intermediate phase, described in the more detailed accounts, involved what the sources characterize as attentiveness to things not present. The affected individuals appeared to perceive with increasing conviction presences, sounds, or phenomena that other occupants of the same space did not share. The monastic records are careful here. The writers are clearly distinguishing between the visionary experiences considered spiritually normative in the monastic context and whatever these individuals were experiencing, because they flag the distinction explicitly. This was not mystical vision, the writers indicate. It was something they experienced as pathological, something that frightened the communities that observed it. The terminal phase, in the cases that ended in death, was described as a complete withdrawal. The person present in body, breathing, apparently physically functional in basic metabolic terms, but absent in every other sense that the monastic observers could articulate. Days, in some recorded cases weeks, in this condition before biological death followed. The phrase used in the most detailed account, a medical text from a monastery in the Turabden region, partially translated in a 1960s academic publication and not, to current knowledge, the subject of subsequent dedicated analysis, describes the final state as the shadow remaining after the person has departed. The body as residue, the person as already gone. The mainstream medical historical interpretation approaches these descriptions through the lens of the epidemic disease environment of the period. The 6th through 8th centuries AD were among the most pathogen-dense in the ancient and medieval Mediterranean world. The Justinianic plague and its recurrent waves, moving through a population with no acquired immunity, produced clinical presentations that contemporary Byzantine and Syriac medical writers documented with increasing sophistication across the period. Neurological and psychiatric sequelae of severe systemic infection, including encephalitic presentations, dissociative states, and profound alterations of consciousness and perception, are documented consequences of several of the pathogen families circulating in the region during this period. A severe encephalitic illness, producing progressive neurological deterioration with prominent psychiatric features, circulating through the close quarters communal environment of monastic communities, could produce the clinical picture the Syriac records describe. The behavioral features, the withdrawal of presence, the peripheral orientation, the apparent perception of stimuli not shared by others, are consistent with encephalitic presentations documented in modern medical literature. The terminal phase of apparent physical persistence without behavioral presence is consistent with severe hypoxic or toxic encephalopathy. That explanation is medically coherent. It is the kind of explanation that satisfies the requirements of parsimony and historical plausibility that academic medical history reasonably demands. It also does not account for several features of the Syriac records that sit outside the standard encephalitic presentation with enough consistency to have attracted the attention of the small number of researchers who have examined the documents most carefully. The first is the geographic pattern. The shadow illness appears in the monastic records not as a diffuse, regionally distributed phenomenon consistent with epidemic spread, but in clusters, concentrated at specific communities, in specific periods, without the progressive geographic propagation that characterizes infectious disease movement through a susceptible population. It does not spread along pilgrimage routes or trade corridors in the way that the plague and other epidemic diseases of the period demonstrably did. It appears, persists within a specific community for a defined period, and stops. Not because it burned through the available susceptible population, as epidemic disease does, but as though, in the language the monastic records themselves use, with a theological framing that the writers clearly found inadequate but reached for in the absence of anything better. It finished what it came to do. The second feature is the selectivity. Within the communities where the shadow illness appeared, not all members were affected. The records note, with a consistency that the writers themselves flagged as significant, that the condition appeared preferentially in individuals who had recently undertaken specific activities. Night vigils in particular locations within the monastery, extended periods of solitary contemplative practice in specific cells or spaces, and in several documented cases, work in or near underground areas of the monastic complex. The association between underground spaces and the onset of the illness is noted in at least 4 independent documents from different communities and different periods, none of which appear to have been in contact with the others. The third feature is the one that has generated the most careful, most restrained, and most telling silence in the academic literature that has touched it. In 2 of the most detailed case records, accounts written by monastic physicians who examined the affected individuals with evident clinical seriousness, the writers describe an observation made during the terminal phase of the illness. In both accounts, in different communities, in documents separated by what appears to be several decades, the physician writers note that the affected individual, in the final days before biological death, cast no shadow. They are precise about this. They note the light conditions. They note their own uncertainty about what they observed. They note that they confirm the observation with other witnesses, and they record it in the careful, evidence-conscious prose of the Syriac medical tradition as a fact. Something they saw, something they could not explain, something they felt as physicians and as monastics, an obligation to document. Whether that observation reflects a genuine perceptual phenomenon produced by the extreme neurological state of the dying individual, a psychological response in the observers to the profound alterations of presence they had been witnessing over days or weeks, or something that the medical frameworks of any period have not yet developed adequate language to describe. The Syriac writers did not know. They wrote it down anyway, and in the manuscript collections where those documents sit, in various states of translation and scholarly attention, the question of what moved through those monastic communities, what the shadow illness actually was, what it selected for, what it did to the people it chose, and why it left when it was finished, remains exactly as open as the physicians who first recorded it left it. An illness that arrived without propagating, that selected without randomness, that left its patients present in body and absent in every other sense, and that, in its final hours, apparently took even the shadows of the people it claimed. Documented, undiagnosed, and waiting, in the quiet of those manuscript collections, for someone with the right questions to finally read it whole. The shadow illness leaves its documents in manuscript collections, waiting for the reader with the right questions. Physicians who wrote down what they saw with clinical precision and theological humility, knowing that the frameworks available to them were insufficient, knowing that the obligation to record outlasted the ability to explain. 2 accounts, separated by decades, from communities that had no contact with each other, describing the same terminal observation. The shadow gone before the person was. It is a particular kind of courage, that the willingness to write down what you cannot explain, in a tradition that values exactness, knowing that the record will outlast the certainty you could not provide. The Syriac monastic writers did not reach for comfortable resolution. They documented the edges of their understanding and stopped there, at the boundary, which is precisely where the most honest inquiry always ends. There is another monastic tradition, running parallel to the Syriac in geography and partially overlapping in time, that practiced the same disciplined fidelity to observation. The desert monasticism of Egypt and the broader North African tradition. The communities that grew up in the Coptic tradition along the Nile, in the eastern desert between the river and the Red Sea, and in the vast, undifferentiated silence of the Saharan margins. These communities were, if anything, even more isolated than their Syriac counterparts, more exposed to the pure, unmediated weight of the desert environment, more intimately acquainted with what the desert does, over time, to the things that human beings build within it. They knew, better than almost anyone in the ancient or medieval world, that the desert is not passive. It does not simply receive what is placed in it and hold it still. It moves, it accumulates, it covers. Given sufficient time and sufficient wind, it will take anything that stands above its surface and draw it down, grain by grain, into itself. The dunes that bury cities are not metaphor in the desert tradition. They are a lived, observed, deeply understood fact of the environment, which makes what was recorded in the Egyptian and North African desert monastic literature about a specific event, or series of events, or a single event described from multiple perspectives, particularly difficult to dismiss as the simple operation of natural desert processes, because the communities that recorded it understood those processes with an intimacy that their urban contemporaries did not share. They knew what sandstorms did and how long they took and what they left behind. And what they recorded was something that did not fit what they knew. The accounts are distributed across several documents in the Coptic and early Arabic monastic literary tradition, spanning approximately the 7th through 9th centuries AD. They vary in detail and in the degree of their elaboration, as accounts transmitted across monastic communities and copied by successive generations of scribes tend to do. But their central event is consistent enough across the variants to suggest a shared referent, a specific occurrence that entered the desert monastic tradition as a known, discussed, theologically significant episode. A monastery was covered by sand, not gradually, over the course of seasons or years, as the desert typically claims abandoned structures through the slow, relentless accumulation of wind-carried material, but in a single night, between the evening canonical hours, when the community was documented as present and functional, and the dawn, when travelers approaching the site found the buildings, or the site where the buildings had been, covered to a depth that the accounts describe variously, but consistently, as complete. Not partially buried, not drifted against, covered. The structure subsumed beneath a volume of sand that the witnesses, experienced desert travelers all, found inconsistent with the meteorological conditions of the preceding night. The monastery is identified in the accounts by a name and a general location in the Egyptian Western Desert, southwest of the Nile Valley, in the margin between the inhabited desert and the deep Saharan interior where human presence thins to nothing. The precise modern identification of the site has not been established, and the location given in the accounts is sufficiently general that multiple researchers have proposed different candidate locations without achieving consensus. What is described in the aftermath accounts, the testimonies of travelers who approached the site, and of any survivors who may have emerged, a point on which the sources are ambiguous, includes details that the natural sandstorm hypothesis accommodates with difficulty. The first is the volume. Desert geologists and physical geographers who have examined the accounts in the context of regional aeolian dynamics have noted that the depth of sand coverage described, sufficient to fully submerge structures of the height typical of desert monastic architecture, would require a volume of transported material that the wind velocities consistent with a single overnight event in that region would not, under normal conditions, produce. Exceptional storm events are possible. The Saharan desert is capable of meteorological behavior that exceeds normal parameters. But the accounts describe conditions on the preceding evening that experienced desert monastics considered unremarkable, nothing that prepared them for what the morning revealed. The second detail is the distribution. Sandstorm burial typically produces an asymmetric deposit, material accumulating on the windward side of structures, creating drifts that reflect the direction and consistency of the wind that carried them. The accounts describe a deposit that witnesses characterized as even, uniform, the structures covered without the directional signature that wind-carried material leaves, as though the sand had descended rather than arrived horizontally. The third detail is the most theologically charged in the original accounts, and the most carefully handled by the researchers who have since examined them. The travelers who arrived at the covered site describe, in the versions of the account that include this element, the absence of any surface disturbance consistent with human exit. No tracks. No impression of emergence. The sand surface above the covered monastery was, by the testimony of those who examined it, undisturbed. The mainstream historical and geological response to this detail is measured and reasonable. Sand surfaces in desert environments are notoriously poor preservers of tracks, which the wind erases within hours or less. The absence of visible tracks at the time of discovery reflects the time elapsed in the continued wind action, not the absence of any exit. Survivors, if there were survivors, would have departed before the covering was complete, by routes that subsequent wind action would have smoothed to invisibility. That explanation is adequate. It accounts for the evidentiary absence without requiring unusual assumptions. It does not account for the volume, or the distribution, or the speed. And it does not account for a detail present in the most complete version of the account. A version preserved in a manuscript in the Coptic collection at the Vatican Library, referenced in a 1940s catalog entry, and not, to current knowledge, the subject of subsequent published analysis. This version includes a passage describing what one of the arriving travelers found when he attempted to excavate a small test area of the surface. A passage that the catalog entry summarizes, in the dry language of archival description, as containing an account of finding the interior spaces of the covered structures apparently intact beneath the sand. Preserved, undisturbed, as though the burial had been not a destruction, but a sealing. The same word appears in the Coptic account that is surfaced, in different languages and different contexts, across multiple points in this exploration. Sealed. Not destroyed. Not collapsed. Sealed. In the Egyptian Western Desert, beneath a depth of sand that arrived in a single night by means that experienced desert monastics found inconsistent with the weather they had observed, a community of monks and their buildings were subsumed into the earth. Whether they were inside when it happened, whether they escaped before or during the covering, whether any of them survived to tell a version of events that the fragmentary accounts we have preserved in distorted form. None of this has been established. The site, whatever its precise location, has not been formally identified or excavated. The desert southwest of the Nile Valley is vast, and the sand that covered the monastery continues, in the natural operation of Saharan Aeolian dynamics, to shift and redistribute across the landscape, moving over what it has claimed with the same unhurried indifference that it brings to everything. Somewhere beneath that sand, if the accounts are grounded in a real event, the interior spaces of a desert monastery remain as they were left, intact, sealed, preserved in the particular perfect stillness that the desert reserves for the things it decides to keep, waiting for the wind to shift, or for someone to ask precisely enough where to dig. Beneath the Egyptian Western Desert, a monastery waits in its sealed silence, preserved in the particular stillness that sand produces when it covers something completely and the wind moves on. The accounts that describe its burial use the same word that has surfaced, quietly and persistently, across the length of this exploration. Sealed. Not destroyed. Not lost. Sealed. As though whatever covered it did so with intention, with the same deliberateness we have encountered in the filled entrance of the Carthaginian shrine, the blocked passage of the Cappadocian cave, the stone rolled across the Northumbrian crypt. The desert seals differently than stone does. It seals with volume and patience, and the indifferent accumulation of particles too small to resist individually and too numerous to overcome collectively. But the result is the same. A space removed from the world above. A threshold closed. Whatever was inside held in a suspended, preserved state that the covering medium maintains with a fidelity that more aggressive forms of concealment cannot match. Sand, like water, keeps what it takes, and the desert tradition of the ancient world understood this. It is not coincidental that the most sacred and the most secret spaces of several ancient cultures were placed, deliberately and with full knowledge of the preservation properties of the medium, within the desert's keeping. The Egyptians understood it across 3,000 years of mortuary practice. The Nabateans, who built their extraordinary civilization in and around the desert margins of the ancient Palestinian landscape, understood it with an intimacy that their architecture expresses in every carved surface and every water-channeling system they left behind. Which brings us, in the final movement of this exploration, to a city that is perhaps the single most visually arresting archaeological site in the world. A place so improbable, so perfectly realized, so thoroughly embedded in the rose-red sandstone of its desert valley that it seems less built than grown. As though the rock itself decided, at some point in the distant past, to become a city. Petra, the ancient capital of the Nabatean kingdom, located in the mountainous desert of what is now southern Jordan, approximately 100 kilometers north of the Gulf of Aqaba. Founded in its monumental form sometime in the 4th century BC, and reaching its apogee as a commercial and cultural center in the 1st century BC through the 1st century AD, Petra controlled the trade routes connecting Arabia, Egypt, the Palestinian coast, and the broader Mediterranean world, with a commercial sophistication that made the Nabatean kings extraordinarily wealthy, and their city extraordinarily ambitious. That ambition is written in sandstone. The facades carved into Petra's cliff faces, the treasury, the monastery, the royal tombs, the street of facades, represent one of the most concentrated demonstrations of architectural carving in the ancient world. The Nabatean craftsmen who executed these facades worked with a precision and a scale that remains, even to modern engineers examining the work, a subject of genuine admiration. The logistics of carving from the top downward, maintaining proportion and symmetry across facades 30 and 40 meters high, in the absence of the scaffolding and measurement technology that modern practice would consider essential, speak to a level of craft knowledge and organizational capacity that the finished monuments demonstrate, but that no text adequately explains. Petra has been studied, surveyed, and partially excavated since the early 19th century. Its major monuments are documented in exhaustive detail. Its topography has been mapped, its water systems analyzed, its inscriptions collected and translated, its material culture cataloged across more than 2 centuries of archaeological engagement. It is, in terms of the scholarly attention it has received, one of the best documented ancient sites in the world, and it still has secrets, not despite the attention, but in a sense, because of it. The concentration of scholarly and tourist focus on Petra's spectacular major monuments has left the margins of the site. The more remote valleys, the less accessible cliff faces, the areas requiring significant physical effort to reach, comparatively understudied. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in the early 21st century have identified subsurface anomalies beneath the central city that have not yet been excavated. Remote sensing work has continued to reveal structural features in the surrounding landscape that ground survey has not followed up. It is in this context of productive incompleteness that a specific feature of the Petra landscape sits. Documented, noted in excavation reports, visited by sufficient numbers of researchers to be established as real, and yet the subject of a level of formal analytical attention that its characteristics appear to warrant but have not yet received. In the cliff faces of the outer valleys surrounding Petra's central urban area, areas accessible but requiring departure from the main tourist circuit, there are tombs that were never finished. This is not, in itself, unusual. Unfinished construction is a common archaeological feature at any major ancient site. Projects were interrupted by death, by economic reversal, by political change, by the simple vicissitudes of ancient life that left intentions unrealized and work stopped mid-execution. But one specific unfinished tomb, in a valley to the southwest of the central city, presents a profile that the researchers who have examined it most carefully describe as unusual in ways that go beyond the ordinary incompleteness of interrupted construction. The tomb's exterior facade was begun. The characteristic Nabatean decorative program, the crow-step parapet, the pilaster columns, The carved entablature was initiated at the upper sections and carried to varying degrees of completion downward, as was standard Nabatean carving practice. At a certain point in the facade's development, the work stopped. Cleanly, abruptly, at a stage that represents neither a natural pause in the construction sequence nor a point at which external interruption would typically have halted work. The stopping point is, in the assessment of researchers familiar with Nabatean construction sequences, anomalous. The interior is more anomalous still. Where Petra's completed tombs present interiors that reflect their function, burial chambers with lockily cut into the walls, carved benches, the spatial organization of a space designed to receive and house the dead. This tomb's interior is something else. The main chamber has been excavated from the rock to a substantial depth, but its walls have not been finished. The tool marks of the initial excavation are visible in the stone, the characteristic pick and chisel patterns of Nabatean rock cutting, progressing inward from the entrance. They stop on all four walls at a consistent depth into the surface, as though the workers reached a point at which they were meant to begin the finishing work, and instead stopped entirely. At the rear of the chamber, where the primary burial niche would typically be cut in a completed Nabatean tomb, there is no niche. There is instead a section of wall that the tool marks approach and then retreat from, a zone of the rock surface that the workers appear to have begun to cut and then withdrawn from, leaving the area untouched. The uncut section is not structurally distinct from the surrounding rock in any way that standard geological analysis has identified. It is the same sandstone, the same formation. There is no obvious physical reason why the cutting stopped where it did. Several researchers examining the tomb have noted that the uncut section of the rear wall corresponds, in its dimensions and position, to the standard location of a loculus in a completed Nabatean burial chamber. If the tomb had been finished, this is precisely where the primary burial would have been placed. The question is not merely why the work stopped. The question is what the workers encountered or decided at that specific point in the rear wall that caused them not simply to pause, but to leave the site in a state of deliberate incompletion. Facade begun, interior excavated, burial niche location identified, and then specifically, apparently intentionally, left uncut. Fringe researchers working with Nabatean religious texts and the broader tradition of sacred geography in the ancient Palestinian landscape have proposed that the tomb's incompletion reflects not interruption, but prohibition. That whatever was encountered at the rear wall, whatever the workers found or experienced or were told about the rock at that specific location, was understood to mark a threshold that Nabatean religious or cosmological understanding did not permit to be crossed. The Nabateans were, among other things, keepers of extraordinarily precise knowledge about the landscape they inhabited. Their water systems demonstrate an understanding of hydrology and subsurface geology that was empirically derived from generations of careful observation. Their placement of sacred sites throughout the Petra landscape reflects a systematic approach to sacred geography that modern researchers are still working to fully decode. They knew their valley. They knew their rock. If the workers who cut that tomb stopped at a specific point in the rear wall and did not return, it was not because they did not know what they were doing. It was because they did. The unfinished tomb waits in its southwestern valley, its facade caught in mid-carving, its interior held at the moment of withdrawal, its rear wall intact and unmarked at the location where the burial should have been. Whatever the Nabatean craftsmen decided not to cut through, whatever lies on the other side of the wall they specifically, deliberately, chose to leave in place, has been waiting in the rose-red sandstone silence of Petra's outer cliffs for 2,000 years, and has not yet been asked what it is. In Petra's southwestern valley, the Nabatean craftsmen stopped at a wall they had decided not to cut through. 2,000 years of desert silence have accumulated on both sides of that decision, on the side we can see, and on the side we cannot. Whatever understanding of the landscape, of the rock, of what lay beyond a specific threshold prompted the withdrawal of those tools has not been recovered. The tomb remains caught at the moment of its own interruption, facade unfinished, interior unresolved, rear wall intact and unmarked and holding, in the rose-red sandstone, whatever it was, always meant to hold. We have traveled far in this exploration, from the volcanic interior of Cappadocia to the tidal island of Iona, from the bone-filled wells of Visigothic Spain to the acoustic valleys of the Sinai, from the whispering caverns of Libya to the sealed shrine of Carthage and the sand-buried monastery of the Egyptian desert. And across all of that distance, across all of those centuries and cultures and forms of evidence, a pattern has persisted with a consistency that is no longer possible to attribute to coincidence. The deliberate arrangement of the dead, the careful management of remains, the specific intentional treatment of the human body, or parts of it, according to systems of meaning that the physical evidence preserves but does not translate. The skull repositioned, the head removed, the bones sorted, the burial incomplete. In each case, someone knew exactly what they were doing. In each case, what they knew has not come down to us. We encounter that pattern one final time, in a location that sits at the confluence of some of the oldest and most layered civilizational traditions in the world. In a landscape where Egypt and sub-Saharan Africa meet, where the Nile narrows between granite cataracts and the desert presses in from both sides, where cultures have been meeting, mixing, conquering, and absorbing each other for longer than almost any other continuously inhabited region on Earth. Nubia, the ancient land stretching along the Nile between the first cataract at Aswan and the confluence of the Blue and White Niles at what is now Khartoum. A corridor of extraordinary historical density, home to civilizations that rivaled Egypt in sophistication, and that Egypt alternately conquered, traded with, and was itself conquered by across 3 millennia of documented interaction. The Nubian kingdoms of Kerma, Kush, Meroe, and their successors left behind pyramids, temples, and material culture of remarkable richness that continues to reshape our understanding of ancient African civilization with each successive excavation season. It is along this corridor, on a small island in the Nile near the Second Cataract in what is now northern Sudan, that a cemetery site was excavated in the 1960s and 1970s as part of the UNESCO-coordinated salvage archaeology campaign preceding the flooding of the Aswan High Dam Reservoir. The site is called Kulubnardi. The excavation, conducted by a team from Southern Methodist University, produced skeletal material from several hundred individuals spanning a broad period of Nubian Christian, or Meroitic transitional, cultural occupation, roughly datable to the early medieval period. The Kulubnardi skeletal collection has been the subject of significant bioarchaeological analysis, primarily focused on the population's health profile, nutritional status, and evidence of the considerable physiological stress that the osteological record reflects. The community buried at Kulubnardi was, by the evidence of their bones, a population living under conditions of chronic nutritional insufficiency and significant disease burden. The skeletal pathology is extensive and has generated a substantial academic literature in the fields of paleopathology and bioarchaeology. That literature is not our concern here. What concerns us is a specific feature of the Kulubnardi burials that the excavation reports document, that subsequent analysts have noted, and that has not, in the decades since the excavations were completed, been the subject of a dedicated, focused, published analysis proportionate to its apparent significance. A subset of the Kulubnardi burials, not a majority, but a consistent and non-trivial proportion distributed across the cemetery's spatial and temporal range, were interred in a condition that the excavation documentation describes with careful archaeological precision, and that subsequent researchers have labeled, in the shorthand that academic literature sometimes adopts for unusual features, as faceless. The term requires clarification. These individuals were not buried without heads. The skulls are present. The skeletons are otherwise complete, interred in the supine, east-oriented position consistent with Nubian Christian burial practice of the period. What is absent, in each case, in this specific subset of burials, is the facial skeleton. The frontal bone, the orbital structures, the nasal bones, the maxilla, the zygomatic arches. The bones that constitute the face in the anatomical sense are missing, not displaced within the grave, not collapsed, not scattered by post-depositional disturbance. Absent. Removed. In several of the best-preserved cases, the removal is clean enough that the excavators noted the absence of the irregular fracture patterns that post-depositional mechanical disturbance produces, and the presence instead of cut or separation marks consistent with deliberate paramortem defleshing and disarticulation of the facial skeleton from the cranial vault and mandible. Someone removed the faces, not the heads. The faces, with deliberate, skilled attention to the specific anatomical structures of the facial skeleton, leaving the cranial vault and the postcranial skeleton entirely intact, and interring the otherwise complete individual in a manner fully consistent with the normative burial practice of the community. The facial bones themselves, as at Northumbria with the monks' heads, are absent from the site entirely. They were not buried nearby. They were taken. The mainstream bioarchaeological response to this feature has been cautious and, in some respects, surprisingly limited given the specificity and consistency of the phenomenon. Taphonomic explanations, post-depositional processes that selectively affect the more fragile facial bones, have been proposed, but the excavators who first documented the burials explicitly noted the evidence against purely taphonomic interpretation in the best-preserved cases. Cultural mortuary practice involving the removal of facial remains is documented in various forms across a wide range of ancient and early medieval cultures, and the Nubian cultural tradition of the period drew on a complex mixture of Meroitic, Egyptian, and Christian mortuary influences that may have incorporated practices not yet fully documented in the formal literature. That is the measured response. It acknowledges the phenomenon, situates it within a broad cultural context, and notes the limitations of current understanding without pressing further. What the measured response does not address is the selectivity. Not all Kolubnardi burials are faceless. A specific subset is. The criteria by which that subset was selected, whether by age, sex, social status, manner of death, or some other characteristic that the skeletal record does or does not preserve, has not been formally analyzed in any publication currently available. Some researchers working in the broader context of Nubian mortuary archaeology have suggested connections to the ancient Egyptian tradition of controlling the deceased's identity and spiritual potency through manipulation of representations of the face, a tradition most elaborately expressed in the funerary mask and the careful preparation of the facial features of the mummified dead, but rooted in a cosmological understanding of the face as the primary locus of individual spiritual identity. Under this framework, the removal of the facial skeleton represents not desecration, but a specific ritual management of the deceased's identity and post-mortem spiritual presence, a practice whose specific theological rationale within the Nubian Christian context has not been recovered. The fringe interpretation moves further, drawing the Kolubnardi faceless burials into the broader pattern of deliberate post-mortem modification that has appeared across this exploration. The Polish skeleton circle, the Northumbrian headless monks, the Visigothic bone wells. Under this view, the removal of the face represents a specific, cross-cultural technology of spiritual management whose underlying logic connected communities across vast geographic distances in the ancient and medieval world, and whose full articulation has not survived in any textual form. Whether that connection is real, or whether it represents the convergence of similar solutions to similar theological problems in unrelated cultural contexts, the Kolubnardi burials do not say. The faces that were removed from those graves were taken to locations that the archaeological record has not identified. The community that practiced the removal did not leave a text explaining their reasons. The skeletal remains that preserve the evidence of what was done are housed in a university collection, documented and analyzed for their pathological content, their demographic profile, their nutritional testimony. The question of why a specific subset of that community was buried without their faces, what those individuals had been, or done, or experienced, or what their community understood them to carry in the bones of their faces that could not be allowed to accompany them into whatever came after. remains, in every published source currently available, unanswered. The Nile still moves past the island of Kulubnardi. The graves are empty now, their contents in storage, their arrangement recorded in excavation drawings that preserve the pattern without decoding it. And somewhere, in the Nubian soil, in the river, in locations that no survey has identified, the faces of the dead wait to be found. Still carrying, perhaps, whatever it was that made their removal necessary.